A young wife collapses against yellow police tape, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. News cameras roll as officers gently hold her back from the crime scene inside her Florida home. She buries her face in her hands, completely shattered by the news that her husband was just murdered in cold blood. It is a flawless, heartbreaking performance because just 3 miles away, sitting quietly in a precinct and watching her fake tears on a live monitor, is her dead husband. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Boynton Beach, Florida, sits bathed in perpetual sunshine, a sprawling network of gated communities, manicured golf courses, and quiet cul-de-sac wealth. It is a place where people go to retire, to disappear, or to completely reinvent themselves. Michael DiPolito desperately needed reinvention. By 2008, he was a man hauling a heavy, suffocating past. A former telemarketing executive, he had operated a massive foreign currency investment fraud, a boiler room scam that siphoned millions from unsuspecting victims. The law eventually caught up with him. He was convicted, stripped of his fraudulent empire, and sentenced to a brief prison term. He walked out of his cell with a lingering, permanent shadow. 28 years of strict probation and a court order to pay $200,000 in restitution. One misstep, one failed drug test, or one unauthorized association with known criminals would send him straight back behind bars for decades. Michael was acutely aware of his fragile freedom. He wanted nothing more than a quiet, boring, legitimate existence. He had a substantial amount of legally obtained money stashed away, a desire to start a clean business, and an overwhelming craving for a traditional family to anchor his new life. That anchor arrived in the form of Dalia Muhammad. She was 26, possessed striking features, and moved with a calculated confidence that instantly disarmed the men around her. Dalia presented herself as an ambitious real estate agent, navigating the volatile Florida housing market. In reality, her primary income streamed from a far older profession. She was working as an escort when she crossed paths with Michael in October 2008. For most men attempting to leave a criminal past behind, associating with an escort might trigger immediate alarms. But Michael was blinded by the sudden, overwhelming attention she showered upon him. Dalia did not judge his felony record. She listened to his anxieties about probation and offered a comforting, supportive shoulder. She projected the exact image of the devoted, loving partner Michael felt he needed to complete his rehabilitation into a normal, upstanding citizen. Dalia, however, viewed the world strictly through a transactional lens. Where Michael saw a supportive confidant, she saw a highly vulnerable, lucrative asset. She quickly deduced the mechanics of his legal situation. She understood that a man on 28 years of probation was a man living in perpetual fear of law enforcement. He was legally compromised, wealthy, and desperately eager to please. She began to meticulously craft her behavior to exploit his deepest insecurities. Dalia adopted the role of the protective, traditional girlfriend. She kept her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her demeanor soft, a stark contrast to the gritty, high-stress reality Michael was trying to escape. Her background had honed her ability to read male psychology, and Michael was an open book. He wanted a wife, a beautiful house, and a clean slate. Dalia promised him the world, masking her cold, analytical nature behind a warm, inviting smile. The local community saw a classic South Florida cliché, a financially comfortable man with a checkered past, walking arm in arm with a beautiful, younger woman. To the neighbors in Boynton Beach, they were just another couple seeking their slice of the American dream. Nobody looked close enough to see the invisible strings Dalia was already attaching to Michael's life, subtly pulling him away from his few remaining friends and isolating him within a bubble of her own design. She was laying the groundwork for total control. The origin of their relationship was purely transactional. In October 2008, Michael hired Dalia for an evening of companionship. He was a man trying to purchase the illusion of a normal life. She was a woman exceptionally skilled at selling illusions. What was supposed to be a single, paid encounter quickly morphed into a permanent fixture. Dalia recognized a highly lucrative target, a wealthy man weighed down by a criminal record and an intense desire to appear respectable. Michael was carrying approximately $200,000 in cash, money he kept hidden to avoid paying court-ordered restitution. He also held equity in a townhouse and drove luxury vehicles. To Dahlia, he was not a partner. He was an unexploited bank account. She initiated a whirlwind romance characterized by intense affection and calculated isolation. Dahlia molded herself into his perfect counterpart. She adopted his interests, anticipated his anxieties, and provided a soft landing pad for a man constantly looking over his shoulder for his probation officer. Within weeks, she convinced him that she was the only person he could truly trust. His old friends were liabilities. His former associates were dangerous. She, and only she, was his safe harbor. The speed of their commitment was staggering. Michael's previous marriage was still in the final stages of dissolution when he met his new companion. He finalized his divorce in February 2009. 5 days later, he stood before a judge and married the woman who had been his escort just 4 months prior. To an outside observer, the timeline reeked of a scam. To Michael, it felt like redemption. He believed he was finally securing the domestic anchor he needed to stay on the right side of the law. But the ink on their marriage certificate marked the beginning of a profound power shift. The dynamics inside their Boynton Beach townhouse changed rapidly. Dahlia began leveraging her husband's legal vulnerabilities against him. She reminded him, constantly yet gently, that holding assets in his name was a massive risk. The state could seize his property to pay off his fraud restitution. A single misstep could result in his accounts being frozen. Her solution was simple and seemingly altruistic. She suggested he transfer the deed of the townhouse into her name. She argued it would protect his equity from the government. She also advised him to hand over the hidden cash, a sum nearing $250,000 for safekeeping. Michael, paralyzed by the fear of losing his wealth and desperate to maintain the trust of his new wife, agreed. He signed over the property. He handed over the cash. In doing so, he effectively handed Dahlia the keys to his entire existence. Once the assets were secured under her legal control, the supportive, attentive wife was slowly replaced by a shadow architect. She began managing the household finances entirely, doling out allowances to a man who had once run a multi-million-dollar operation. She intercepted his mail. She monitored his phone calls under the guise of protecting him from negative influences. The physical space of the townhouse began to reflect this erasure. Dahlia redecorated, replacing his belongings with her own sterile, modern aesthetics. The walls were painted neutral tones, the surfaces kept obsessively clean. Michael's footprint in his own home shrank to a few drawers and a single closet. Outside, the oppressive, suffocating heat of the South Florida summer settled over the city, a thick humidity that made the air heavy to breathe. Inside, the temperature was kept notoriously cold, matching the quiet, calculated atmosphere Dahlia was cultivating. She controlled his diet, asserting dominance over his basic daily routines. Every aspect of his day was scheduled and monitored. If he went to the gym, she knew exactly how long the drive took. If the trip took 5 minutes too long, she demanded explanations. She also began to weaponize his probation. Dahlia manufactured an atmosphere of constant paranoia. She would casually mention seeing unmarked cars parked down the street, suggesting the police were monitoring him. She would ask pointed questions about his daily schedule, making him feel as though one wrong move would trigger a violation. Michael's former defense attorney, the one man who could navigate his legal minefield, was systematically pushed away. Dahlia intercepted communications, telling the lawyer that Michael was fine, busy, and did not need to speak with him. The problem for Dahlia was that Michael was a relatively young, healthy man. He was not going to simply fade away. If she divorced him, the asset transfers might be scrutinized by a judge during a contentious settlement. The state might look into where the money came from. The townhouse deed could be contested. A divorce was messy, public, and financially risky. For the new bride, the calculus was purely logical. A divorced woman has to split the assets and answer questions. A grieving widow inherits everything and receives the sympathy of the community. She did not just want the money he had given her. She wanted absolute ownership without the burden of his existence. He had served his purpose. He had funded her lifestyle, bought her a home, and provided a massive infusion of cash. Now, he was merely a liability taking up space in her house. The psychological manipulation was about to evolve into a physical threat. She needed him gone, and she began to explore the most efficient ways to erase him from the board. August 5th, 2009, began with the suffocating heavy humidity typical of South Florida summers. By 6 in the morning, the temperature was already pushing 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the air thick and unyielding. Inside the Boynton Beach townhouse, the central air conditioning hummed a steady, cold rhythm, a sharp contrast to the psychological heat boiling beneath the surface. Dahlia moved through the quiet house with deliberate, chilling purpose. She dressed in her fitted workout clothes, gathered her keys, and prepared to leave for a spin class at the local LA Fitness. This was not a spontaneous decision to focus on her physical health. She was following strict, cold-blooded instructions. The man she believed to be a seasoned contract killer had explicitly told her to establish an ironclad alibi for this exact morning. She needed to be miles away, surrounded by witnesses, completely visible to surveillance cameras, and swiping her gym membership card at the exact moment the execution took place. She walked out the front door, the heavy lock clicking shut behind her, got into her SUV, and drove away. She left her husband sleeping peacefully inside, completely unaware that his wife had just checked out of their brief marriage by finalizing his death sentence. The moment her vehicle's taillights vanished down the long, palm-lined street, the quiet neighborhood violently transformed. The Boynton Beach Police Department had been waiting in the wings, staging their vehicles just out of sight. Now, they descended on the property with tactical precision. This operation required absolute, flawless deception. If Dahlia returned and sensed even a fraction of a misstep, a misplaced cruiser, a smiling officer, a lack of urgency, the entire sting would collapse, and they would lose the chance to lock her away. They needed a hyper-realistic, chaotic crime scene. Unmarked cars and black and white cruisers rolled in rapidly, parking at sharp, aggressive angles across the driveway and the pristine front lawn. Heavy doors slammed. Tactical boots hit the hot pavement. Uniformed officers unspooled hundreds of feet of bright yellow crime scene tape, wrapping it around the mailbox, the trees, and the front pillars, aggressively cordoning off the home. The flashing red and blue light bars painted the surrounding stucco houses in frantic, rhythmic pulses. They brought in a mobile command unit. They requested an actual forensic technician to walk the grounds carrying an evidence kit. To any neighbor looking out their window, a horrific, bloody tragedy had just occurred in their quiet subdivision. But inside the heavily guarded house, the primary target of the assassination was entirely unharmed, though highly cooperative and deeply shaken by what he was about to witness. Adding a deeply surreal, almost dystopian layer to the morning was the presence of a television production crew. The hit reality show Cops was embedded with the Boynton Beach Department for the season. Camera operators carrying heavy shoulder rigs stepped out of the unmarked vans into the crushing morning humidity. They adjusted their lenses, wiping away the instant condensation. Boom operators extended their microphones, capturing the crunch of gravel and the static hiss of police radios. The producers and the police had coordinated this theatrical performance down to the exact minute. The cameras were positioned strategically to capture the driveway, the front door, and the precise spot where the lead investigator would intercept the grieving widow. It was a bizarre, unprecedented intersection of law enforcement and entertainment, a fake murder scene built from scratch to capture a very real conspirator, all being documented for national television. The officers wiped sweat from their foreheads, checking their watches, waiting for the signal. The trap was set. Now, they just needed the predator to walk back into it. At approximately 6:15, the crackle of the dispatcher's voice broke the tension. The perimeter units confirmed the target's vehicle was approaching. The low hum of Dahlia's SUV grew louder as she navigated the familiar turns of her upscale neighborhood. As she rounded the final corner, the towering wall of police cruisers and blinding flashing lights came into full view. She parked her vehicle hastily, leaving the engine running for a brief moment before stepping out onto the hot asphalt. She power-walked toward the yellow tape, her pace quickening, projecting the exact frantic body language of a panicked, confused homeowner returning to a disaster. The heavy air smelled of exhaust fumes and heated plastic. The camera operators smoothly adjusted their focus, tracking her every movement, recording history. An undercover officer stepped forward, breaking the perimeter to intercept her just at the edge of the crime scene tape. He held up a hand, establishing a firm physical barrier. She immediately demanded to know what was happening, her voice rising in a carefully calibrated pitch of breathless anxiety. The officer kept his tone flat, professional, and entirely devoid of empathy. He informed her that there had been a severe incident at the residence. She pressed harder, asking about her husband, her eyes wide and searching. The officer paused, a deliberate, agonizing beat designed to stretch her anticipation to the breaking point, before delivering the fatal news. He stated plainly that her husband was dead. The physical reaction was instantaneous and fiercely theatrical. Dahlia's knees buckled violently beneath her. She collapsed toward the officer, her hands clutching frantically at his dark uniform shirt. A high-pitched, agonizing wail ripped from her throat, echoing sharply off the walls of the surrounding houses. She buried her face in her hands, her small shoulders heaving with violent, rhythmic sobs. The tears flowed freely, ruining her carefully applied makeup, streaming down her cheeks as she gasped for air. She rocked back and forth against the searing metal of the police cruiser, projecting the flawless image of a woman whose entire universe had just been violently shattered. It was a terrifying masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. The sheer audacity of her grief was breathtaking to witness. She was sobbing uncontrollably for a man she had actively paid to have eliminated just days prior. She was mourning a corpse that did not exist. Every single tear, every guttural scream, every hyperventilating gasp was a calculated, desperate move to solidify her innocence and claim the narrative. She believed she had won. She believed the hitman had succeeded. The obstacle was permanently removed, and now all she had to do was survive the performance of a lifetime. But the men surrounding her were completely immune to the display. Behind their dark, mirrored sunglasses, the officers watched her with chilling, clinical detachment. The camera lenses zoomed in closer, capturing the microscopic details of her fake breakdown, the lack of real shock in her eyes, the forced nature of the wails. No one rushed forward to genuinely comfort her. The officer supporting her dead weight did so mechanically, merely going through the motions of the script they had rehearsed. He gently guided her away from the house, explaining calmly that they needed her to come down to the station for a formal interview to help them piece together the timeline of the tragedy. Still weeping loudly, still clutching her chest as if her heart had been physically torn out, she nodded her compliance. An officer opened the heavy rear door of a waiting police cruiser. The sterile, hard plastic seat awaited her. As she slid into the back of the car, the heavy door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside the steel cage. The lock engaged with a sharp, heavy metallic click. The performance in the driveway was over. The physical trap had successfully closed around her. Now, the true psychological dismantling was about to begin inside the cold, windowless walls of a police interrogation room. To understand how the grieving widow ended up secured in the back of that patrol car, the timeline must rewind to the humid weeks of July. Dahlia had realized that a conventional divorce was entirely too messy. A legal separation meant asset division, hostile depositions, and a microscopic examination of the real estate transfers she had so carefully orchestrated. She did not want half of the pie. She wanted the entire bakery, and she wanted the previous owner completely erased. Her first strategy was bureaucratic assassination. She knew her husband's biggest vulnerability was his strict, unforgiving probation. A single felony charge would trigger an automatic violation, burying him in the state penitentiary for the next 2 decades. She acquired a small, tightly sealed baggie of cocaine and wedged it deep inside the spare tire compartment of his luxury SUV. The moment he drove away for an afternoon meeting, she picked up a burner phone. She called in an anonymous, urgent tip to the local authorities, reporting a suspicious vehicle driven by a convicted fraudster carrying narcotics. The trap snapped shut a few miles down the highway. Patrol units swarmed the SUV, pulling the confused driver onto the hot shoulder of the road. They tore through the interior, eventually extracting the hidden powder. The target was paralyzed with genuine, suffocating terror. He vehemently denied any knowledge of the drugs, his hands shaking violently against the hood of the cruiser. The officers paused. Perhaps they sensed the glaringly amateurish nature of the frame job, or perhaps his sheer panic registered as authentic. They confiscated the contraband but declined to instantly file the catastrophic probation violation. The legal execution had failed. Law enforcement was far too unpredictable for Dahlia's liking. If the state refused to remove him, she would handle the logistics herself. The humming central air conditioning inside their townhouse masked the bitter chill of her next escalation. She procured a jug of antifreeze, an easily accessible, sweet-tasting chemical that induces rapid, agonizing renal failure. She poured a heavy, viscous dose into a tall glass of iced tea, the condensation beating on the glass as she handed it over with a practiced, supportive smile. He took one large, thirsty gulp. He immediately gagged, violently spitting the liquid into the stainless steel sink. He complained of a sharp, chemical burn scorching the back of his throat. Dahlia calmly apologized without missing a single beat, blaming a spoiled batch of artificial sweetener, and quickly washed the evidence down the drain. 2 attempts, 2 absolute failures. The husband was stubbornly clinging to his freedom and his life. She realized she lacked the technical proficiency for a clean murder. She needed a professional. She combed through the contacts from her previous life and reached out to Mohammed Shihadeh. He was an acquaintance operating on the fringes of the local nightlife scene, a man who navigated the gray areas of the city and supposedly knew people who dealt in violence. She arranged a meeting at a local convenience store parking lot. Sitting in the oppressive, stagnant heat of his car, she did not mince her words. She asked him directly to find a contract killer. Shihadeh initially brushed the request off. He assumed it was the dark, exaggerated venting of a deeply frustrated spouse. But the demands did not stop. She texted him relentlessly. She called him at odd hours. She offered a thick envelope of cash just for a preliminary introduction. The mechanical, dead-eyed tone of her voice stripped away any illusion of a joke. A deep, cold knot formed in Shihadeh's stomach. He realized with terrifying clarity that if he refused to help, she would simply find another broker. A man was going to be slaughtered in his own home, and Shihadeh would be the silent accomplice who let it happen. On July 21st, he made a decision that altered the trajectory of the entire conspiracy. He drove his vehicle straight to the local police precinct. He walked through the sterile, brightly lit lobby, bypassed the routine complaint desk, and demanded to speak with the Criminal Investigations Division. He laid the plot out on the table, explaining that a wealthy, beautiful woman was actively shopping for an executioner. Detectives are naturally skeptical of informants, especially those claiming a suburban housewife is orchestrating a hit. To verify the lethal threat, they required hard audio. They wired Shihadeh with a concealed recording device and instructed him to set up another meeting. 2 days later, the trap was armed. Dahlia climbed into the passenger seat of Shihadeh's sedan. A few blocks away, detectives sat hunched inside an unmarked van, listening to the live static feed through heavy headphones. The audio was bone-chilling. Dahlia complained bitterly about the delays. She negotiated the cost of a human life with the exact same casual cadence one might use to price a kitchen renovation. When Shihadeh attempted to offer her a final psychological exit, asking repeatedly if she was absolutely certain she wanted to cross this irreversible line, she did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She stated emphatically that she was 5,000% sure. Inside the surveillance van, the detectives exchanged grim looks. The audio was damning, but a solicitation charge requires bulletproof evidence of intent and a definitive financial transaction. If they arrested her right then, a high-priced defense attorney could easily spin the recording as a fantasy roleplay or a gross misunderstanding. They needed her to pull the trigger. They needed her to meet the killer, look him in the eye, and hand over the cash. The department mobilized immediately. They were not going to wait for the wife to find a murderer. They were going to supply one. The Boynton Beach Police Department did not have the luxury of time. The audio captured by the informant proved the threat was active, imminent, and highly funded. To secure an airtight solicitation of murder charge, they needed a controlled environment where the suspect would willingly hand over capital to a perceived assassin. They brought in Officer Whitey Jean, an undercover specialist capable of projecting the quiet, lethal menace of a seasoned hitman. On a scorching early August afternoon, the staging ground was set in a sprawling, sun-baked pharmacy parking lot. John parked his heavily tinted, unmarked vehicle far from the main entrance, away from the foot traffic. The dashboard camera was meticulously hidden deep inside the air vents, the internal microphones calibrated to pick up the slightest whisper over the low hum of the engine. The heat outside was baking the asphalt to well over 100 degrees, creating shimmering mirages off the hoods of parked cars. Inside the vehicle, the air conditioning blasted a steady, freezing current, creating a sterile, isolated bubble for the deadly transaction. The target arrived exactly on schedule. She slipped into the passenger seat, bringing a sudden wave of heavy, sweet perfume into the confined, chilled space. There was zero hesitation in her movements. She did not tremble, she did not look over her shoulder at passing shoppers, and she did not ask for reassurance. She settled into the leather seat and immediately got to work, treating the intimidating man next to her like a standard contractor hired to remodel a kitchen or fix a leaking roof. The undercover officer pressed her for specifics. For the state attorney to authorize an arrest, the recording needed explicit intent. He could not lead the witness. She had to dictate the exact terms of the contract on tape. He asked if she merely wanted the target severely beaten, hospitalized, or permanently removed. She stated calmly, without a single inflection of doubt, that he needed to be killed. To ensure no logistical errors were made, she detailed the layout of the Boynton Beach townhouse. She explained the mechanics of the security system, the location of the spare keys hidden outside, and the exact predictable schedule her husband kept. Reaching into her designer purse, she retrieved a stack of glossy photographs of the victim, pointing out his specific facial features with a perfectly manicured finger so the killer would not make a mistake. Jean pushed one final time, offering her a distinct, undeniable exit ramp. He warned her that once he walked out of the vehicle, the job was done. There was no reversing the order, no changing her mind, and no calling it off once the wheels were in motion. She dismissed his grim warning with a slight, almost irritated wave of her hand, confirming her absolute certainty. To seal the lethal pact, she handed over $1,200 in crisp, banded cash. It was a down payment intended for the purchase of a firearm. She promised the remaining $3,000 would be delivered the moment the execution was confirmed. The heavy car door opened, letting the suffocating Florida heat wash back in. She stepped out into the blinding sunlight, entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just purchased a murder. 4 days later, the trap violently snapped shut. Following her spectacular weeping performance at the fake crime scene, the grieving widow was transported to the local police precinct. The interrogation room was a masterclass in psychological pressure. It was a small, claustrophobic box, completely windowless and aggressively illuminated by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast long, unnatural shadows against the pale walls. The temperature was kept deliberately low, forcing suspects to shiver. Dahlia sat alone at a heavy metal table, clutching a crumpled tissue. Her shoulders still shook with manufactured, rhythmic sobs. She was playing the role of the devastated survivor to absolute perfection, waiting for her audience. Lead detectives entered the room with solemn, grief-stricken expressions. They carried yellow legal notepads and spoke in hushed, intensely sympathetic tones. Their strategy was simple. They needed to lock her into an impenetrable alibi before systematically tearing it apart. They gently asked her to recount her entire morning. Sniffling into her tissue, she explained her early trip to the fitness center, her agonizing drive back to the house, and the horrific, blinding shock of seeing the yellow police tape across her driveway. She eagerly offered up potential suspects, pointing fingers at her husband's former business associates. She suggested his criminal past in telemarketing fraud had finally caught up with him, framing the hit as a revenge killing. She was fiercely cooperative, desperately trying to direct the massive weight of the investigation as far away from herself as possible. The detectives listened patiently, nodding in apparent agreement, letting her weave a massive, intricate web of lies. They asked if she knew anyone who would personally want to harm him. She shook her head, tears welling up on command. They inquired about the state of her recent marriage. She insisted they were deeply in love, planning a long future together, and were completely inseparable. The officers let the silence stretch, a long, heavy, agonizing pause that finally made the suspect shift uncomfortably in her rigid plastic chair. The low hum of the ventilation system was the only sound in the room. Then, the lead investigator's tone abruptly shifted. The warm sympathy vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, surgical edge. He informed her that they had a primary suspect in custody. He stated that the patrol units had arrested the man who pulled the trigger, and that the killer had already confessed everything. Dahlia's eyes widened slightly, a microscopic fracture in her flawless, grieving facade. She asked who it was, her voice losing a fraction of its theatrical, high-pitched quiver. The detective leaned forward, placing his heavy hands flat on the scratched metal table. He told her she did not need to guess, because they were going to show her exactly who had survived the morning. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room clicked open. Michael DiPolito walked into the room. He was not a bloody corpse lying on a stainless steel medical examiner's slab. He was not bleeding out onto the hardwood floor of their pristine living room. He was wearing a simple t-shirt, completely unharmed, his face drained of all color, staring down at the woman he had married just 6 months prior. The detectives had intercepted him before dawn, pulling him out of the townhouse long before Dahlia returned from the gym. They had brought him to the station and forced him into a viewing room. He had spent the last several hours listening to the undercover tapes. Hearing his own wife negotiate the exact price of a bullet meant for his skull. The betrayal etched onto his exhausted features was raw, devastating, and absolute. The reaction from Dahlia was a terrifying testament to her psychological wiring. The manufactured sobbing stopped instantly. The tears dried up in a fraction of a second. Her spine straightened against the plastic chair. Faced with the living, breathing proof of her catastrophic failure, she did not apologize. She did not break down in genuine remorse or shock. Instead, her dark eyes darted rapidly between her towering husband and the detectives, her brain frantically calculating a new angle of survival. She looked directly at Michael, the man she had just paid to have slaughtered, and asked him with a tone of mild, innocent confusion what was going on. She told him to come closer, reaching out her hand as if seeking physical comfort from the ghost standing in front of her. Michael recoiled, taking a sharp, defensive step backward toward the heavy door. He looked at her with a terrifying mixture of profound horror and absolute disgust, shaking his head slowly. The illusion was completely shattered. He muttered that he had seen the undercover tapes, that he knew exactly what she had done, before turning his back on her and walking out of the room, leaving her alone with the devastating consequences of her actions. The heavy click of the door locking behind him echoed through the room like a gunshot. The grieving widow act was officially dead. The detectives dropped the remaining pretense. They placed a thick laptop on the metal table and hit play. The tiny speakers filled the sterile room with her own voice, the chilling, transactional audio of her handing over cash in the pharmacy parking lot. The officers formally advised her of her rights, and the cold metallic bite of steel handcuffs snapped securely around her slender wrists. The courtroom in West Palm Beach became a theater of the surreal. The prosecution meticulously laid out the mountain of evidence, the chilling audio tapes, the bank statements proving the transfer of assets, and the testimony of the informant who had saved a life. Dahlia's defense team, however, opted for a strategy that seemed torn from a desperate tabloid headline. They argued that the entire hitman plot was nothing more than a bizarre, elaborate stunt. They claimed she was a fame-hungry provocateur who never actually intended for the murder to occur, but simply wanted the footage to pitch to producers. The jury found the defense as hollow as the defendant's tears. In 2011, she was found guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. Following years of legal maneuverings, mistrials, and appeals, a judge sentenced her to 16 years behind bars. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A radiant young woman steps out of a car at a high society wedding. She wears a pristine white dress, smiling effortlessly as champagne is poured. It is September 1996, and to everyone present, she is the golden girl of Australian water polo, a dedicated athlete and a respected private school teacher. But just 3 hours earlier, she walked out of a local hospital holding a newborn, a child birthed in total secrecy. By the time the wedding reception began, the infant had vanished, never to be seen again. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The coastal suburb of Manly sits just 10 miles from Sydney's bustling center. It is an affluent, sun-drenched enclave where social currency is heavily dictated by reputation, physical prowess, and success. In the mid-1990s, this community operated on a rigid hierarchy of respectability. At the very top of that social ladder stood Kelly Lane. Born into a family that demanded excellence, her life was structured around intense discipline and public perception. Her father was a highly respected retired police inspector. In a household anchored by a former law enforcement officer, the boundaries of acceptable behavior were strictly defined. Success was expected, and public embarrassment was simply not an option. This environment bred a specific type of psychological armor. Kelly learned early on how to project absolute perfection, regardless of the internal cost. By her early 20s, she had constructed a flawless public identity. She was a physical powerhouse, a fiercely competitive water polo player who dominated the pool. The sport itself is brutal and exhausting, requiring athletes to endure violent, breathless struggles beneath the water while maintaining a composed, upright posture above the surface. It was a dynamic that would soon define her entire existence. She spent hours training in frigid 60-degree Fahrenheit water, building a physique designed to absorb punishment and hide fatigue. Her talent was undeniable, placing her firmly on the trajectory for the upcoming 2000 Olympic Games. She was the athlete everyone admired, the one destined for national glory. Her ambition extended well beyond the water's edge. Kelly cultivated a sterling professional reputation, securing a position as a physical education teacher at an exclusive private school. The role required her to be a paragon of virtue and responsibility to her teenage students. Parents trusted her. Teammates relied on her. Her father beamed with pride. She was the ultimate local success story. However, the architecture of this life was incredibly fragile. In the upper echelons of Manly's conservative society, an unplanned, out-of-wedlock pregnancy was viewed as a scandalous career ender. For an elite athlete, it meant immediate expulsion from the Olympic training squad and the sudden death of a lifelong dream. For a private school teacher, it guaranteed judgment, whispering parents, and a permanently tarnished reputation. For a police inspector's daughter, it meant becoming an object of pity rather than pride. The pressure to maintain the facade was suffocating. Kelly had spent 2 decades building a monument to her own ambition, and the terror of watching it crumble dictated her every move. She developed an uncanny ability to compartmentalize her reality. When the immense stress of her hidden life began to mount, she simply locked the anxiety away behind a wide, photogenic smile. She became an expert at managing perceptions, manipulating angles, and steering conversations away from anything that threatened her image. Her body was her instrument, and she knew exactly how to control it. Broad shoulders, a solid 165-pound athletic frame, and the baggy, oversized tracksuits, typical of the era, provided the ultimate camouflage. She learned to endure unimaginable physical discomfort without a single grimace. The community saw only what she allowed them to see, a dedicated teacher and a fierce competitor heading for the Olympics. They never noticed the heavy, restrictive binding she wore under her uniform or the deliberate changes in her posture. The illusion was impenetrable, and it set the psychological stage for a series of catastrophic decisions that would eventually shatter her golden world. In the hyper-competitive social ecosystem she navigated, romantic partnerships functioned as an extension of personal branding. Enter Duncan Gillies. He was a prominent rugby union player, possessing the rugged athleticism and social standing that perfectly complemented her carefully curated public profile. Together, they looked like the ultimate power couple, 2 elite competitors dominating their respective arenas, moving seamlessly through the region's high society circles. But the relationship was inherently fractured. Both were fiercely dedicated to grueling training regimens, resulting in a dynamic that was often intermittent and distracted. This lack of constant day-to-day proximity provided the exact operational cover required to execute an unimaginable deception. The mechanics of hiding a full-term pregnancy are complex for an average person. For a competitive water polo player, it borders on biological impossibility. The sport requires athletes to wear tight, unyielding Lycra swimsuits that cling to every contour of the body. Yet, as the months progressed and the physical reality of gestation set in, her psychological armor hardened. She developed a series of intricate physical and emotional tactics designed to gaslight everyone in her immediate orbit. When teammates noticed her thickening waistline or the sudden heaviness in her movements through the water, she had her answers ready. She explained the bulk away as the result of a new, intensive weightlifting regimen designed to build core strength. If a coach pointed out a sluggish lap time or a shortness of breath, it was swiftly attributed to overtraining or a temporary hormonal imbalance. She weaponized her own athletic dedication, using the extreme rigors of her sport as a convenient, impenetrable shield against scrutiny. Even her mother, a woman who lived in the exact same house, was successfully manipulated. When questioned about her changing shape, the response was swift and intensely defensive, a masterclass in emotional deflection that made the older woman feel intrusive for even asking. The athlete wore bulky tracksuits, layered sweatshirts, and tightly wound athletic tape to bind her abdomen. She learned to hold her breath and suck in her stomach when walking past mirrors or lingering in the communal locker rooms. The most terrifying aspect of this dual reality was navigating intimacy. Duncan remained a fixture in her life, completely oblivious to the biological transformation happening right in front of him. Maintaining a romantic relationship while hiding a third trimester bump required a staggering level of psychological compartmentalization. Intimacy was strictly controlled. The environment was meticulously managed. Lights remained off, and physical boundaries were artificially established under the guise of sports-related soreness or deep fatigue. Imagine the sheer mental endurance required to lie in bed next to a partner, feeling the unmistakable movement of a child kicking against your ribs, and remaining absolutely silent. She was living in a perpetual state of red alert. One misplaced hand, one unexpected embrace, one moment of vulnerability could cause the entire facade to collapse. The physical toll was agonizing. A body preparing for childbirth naturally softens, ligaments stretch, and the center of gravity drastically shifts. Yet she continued to dive into the aggressive, physically violent arena of competitive water polo. The sport demands athletes tread water using a relentless egg beater kick to stay afloat. She was performing this exhausting maneuver while carrying an extra 15 to 20 pounds of hidden weight. Opponents would kick, scratch, and pull underwater. She absorbed this blunt force trauma at 7, 8, and nearly 9 months pregnant, masking the excruciating pain of a changing body forced to perform at a championship standard. She was attempting to override her own biology through sheer force of will. This was not merely a young woman terrified of parental disappointment. It was a pathological commitment to an image. The child growing inside her was not perceived as a developing human entity, but rather as an existential threat to the life she had painstakingly built. Every extra pound was a severe liability. Every medical checkup she avoided was a calculated risk to keep the secret buried. She became a ghost in her own life, present in photographs and at local gatherings, but emotionally severed from reality. She attended weekend parties, drinking heavily to maintain the illusion of carefree normalcy, smiling brightly for the cameras while a hidden biological clock ticked down to an inevitable conclusion. The isolation must have been absolute. There was no confidant, no journal, no momentary lapse in the performance. The mask was permanently affixed. She had convinced her teammates she was just bulking up for the season. She had convinced her partner she was merely exhausted. Most chillingly, she had almost managed to convince herself that the biological reality could be neatly erased the moment it arrived. The architecture of her deception was flawless, setting the stage for a timeline of events that would defy all logic and basic human instinct. September 12th arrived with a chillingly calculated logistical shift. Manly was a fishbowl, a place where privacy was impossible. To execute the final phase of her concealment, the athlete required total anonymity. She drove 15 miles west to Auburn Hospital, a busy working-class facility deeply removed from her affluent northern beaches enclave. It was an entirely different demographic universe. No parents from her elite private school walked these corridors. No water polo teammates lived in this district. No one here knew the Golden Girl. She checked herself into the maternity ward completely alone. The physical trauma of labor commenced. For a woman conditioned to absorb blunt force trauma in a freezing pool, the agony of childbirth was simply another metric to manage, another physical threshold to conquer in silence. She utilized the exact same breathing techniques, the same stoic endurance that kept her afloat during a brutal match. Hours later, a healthy infant was born, a girl, weighing just over 7 pounds. She named her Tegan. For the next 48 hours, the sterile hospital room became a stage. The performance required a masterclass in psychological balance. She had to appear maternal enough to avoid raising clinical alarms, yet detached enough to facilitate an immediate, untraceable exit strategy. Nurses rotated through the ward, checking vitals, adjusting bassinet blankets. They observed a calm, highly articulate young woman who held her baby, fed her, and engaged in polite, unremarkable small talk. The sharp smell of iodine and bleached linen filled the small space. There were no tears. There were no hysterical breakdowns. There were no indicators of postpartum distress or panic. Hospital protocol dictated a mandatory consultation with a social worker to discuss the mother's discharge plan, particularly since she possessed no visible support system and had arrived unaccompanied. The athlete had her narrative meticulously prepared. She explained calmly that she could not keep the child due to the intense demands of her career and her rigid athletic commitments. It was a rational, pragmatic explanation that resonated with the busy medical staff. But she was not surrendering the baby to the state for adoption. Instead, she introduced a specific, crucial detail into the official record, a name that would haunt the investigation for decades. She stated the biological father was a man named Andrew Morris. According to the story she smoothly delivered to the social worker, Tegan was the result of a brief, casual affair. She claimed Morris had a stable partner, and they had collectively agreed to take full custody of the infant. It sounded like a modern, albeit messy, private arrangement. She provided an address and a phone number for this man, asserting that she would be handing the child over directly to him upon leaving the facility. The social worker listened, took notes, and found no immediate reason for intervention. The mother was, after all, a respected private school teacher. She was educated, composed, and seemingly acting in the child's best interest. The bureaucratic boxes were checked. The illusion held firm. Saturday, September 14th, the morning of the discharge. The hospital routine hummed along, breakfast trays clattering in the linoleum hallways, doctors completing their final rounds. She dressed the newborn in ordinary infant clothing. She packed her small duffel bag. The paperwork was signed, finalizing her release from medical care. Just before noon, she walked out of the maternity ward holding Tegan. The heavy automatic doors of Auburn Hospital slid open, and she stepped out into the bright spring sunlight. No one escorted her to a waiting vehicle. There was no clinical record of an infant car seat being inspected. She simply vanished into the sprawling suburban landscape. What happened next represents one of the most chilling black holes in modern criminal history. A 3-hour window of absolute silence. A 15-mile drive separated Auburn from the northern beaches. The route cut through dense urban sprawl, industrial zones, and crossed major waterways. In the passenger space, a 48-hour-old infant. Behind the wheel, a woman racing against a rigid social calendar. The pacing of her life left no room for hesitation. The athlete had to erase an entire human existence before mid-afternoon. There are no witnesses to this drive. No security cameras captured her pulling over into a secluded bushland, stopping by a commercial dumpster, or lingering near the dark, deep waters of the harbor. The environment was vast, and a 7-pound newborn requires terrifyingly little space to conceal. The mechanics of the disposal remain locked entirely inside her mind. Did the child cry? Was there a fracturing of the emotional armor? A final moment of maternal hesitation? Or was the act executed with the same ruthless, robotic efficiency she utilized to drown out the pain of an Olympic training session? A living, breathing girl entered that narrow corridor of time, and only a solitary woman emerged from the other side. The timeline was brutally tight. The pragmatic erasure of a life had to be completed swiftly because her presence was required elsewhere. By 3 p.m., she was back in her territory. The transition from maternity ward patient to high society wedding guest is a psychological leap that defies basic human comprehension. A woman 2 days postpartum is experiencing massive hormonal shifts, profound physical soreness, and active bleeding. Yet, she returned to her parents' house and methodically erased the hospital from her body. She stood in the shower, washing away the scent of antiseptic and newborn skin. She dried her hair. She carefully applied her makeup, masking the dark circles of a grueling labor with expensive cosmetics. Then, she slipped her body, a body that had just been torn open by childbirth, into a pristine, fitted white dress. The wedding reception was already in full swing. Sunlight glinted off crystal glasses on manicured lawns. She arrived exactly as expected. The golden girl. Her boyfriend, Duncan, was there. Her parents were mingling with friends. She waded into the crowd, accepting a cold glass of champagne. She smiled for the photographer. She laughed at jokes. She engaged in lighthearted banter about the upcoming water polo season. Not a single person in that affluent crowd suspected anything. No one noticed a wince of pain when she sat down. No one detected the physical trauma hidden beneath the white fabric. She stood on the manicured grass, surrounded by her tight-knit community, radiating the absolute picture of health and success. Less than 3 hours prior, she had walked out of a hospital with her own daughter. Now, sipping champagne, the baby was gone. The problem was solved. The calendar was clear. The facade remained entirely intact. The sunlit days bled into years. The 2000 Olympic Games were fast approaching, and her athletic regimen intensified. The heavy smell of chlorine, the echoing whistles in the aquatic center, the grueling burn of lactic acid. These were the grounding realities she clung to. The missing infant was entirely erased from the physical world. No birth announcements, no quiet questions from relatives, a complete, unblemished void. She compartmentalized the hospital incident so deeply that it barely registered as a memory. It was simply a logistical hurdle she had successfully cleared. But biological reality is stubborn, and paper trails are unforgiving. In 1999, the machinery of her secret life finally jammed. A dedicated social worker sat in a quiet, fluorescent-lit agency office, reviewing medical history files. The athlete was processing paperwork for a completely separate, subsequent adoption, another hidden pregnancy successfully carried to term. The state requires absolute transparency when relinquishing a child. The air in the archives was stale, humming with the low vibration of overhead vents. As the caseworker turned the crisp manila pages of the clinical record, a massive discrepancy glared back from the ink. Medical charts meticulously document every obstetric event. The file clearly indicated a previous live birth, a female infant delivered in the fall of 1996. The social worker typed the details into the state registry terminal. The blinking cursor returned a blank screen. Nothing. No adoption records, no foster care placements, no death certificate. The child existed solely as a sterile notation in a maternal health file, a phantom recorded in blue ink. Routine protocol dictates that any unaccounted minor in the system triggers an immediate inquiry. The caseworker contacted the mother, expecting a simple clerical error, perhaps an interstate move, or a private familial arrangement that had bypassed standard logging. When asked about the location of her firstborn daughter, the athlete did not hesitate. Her pulse remained steady. She seamlessly deployed the narrative she had constructed 3 years prior in the maternity ward. She stated firmly that the child was safe, living with her biological father. She provided the name again, Andrew Morris. The hunt for this man began as a standard welfare check and rapidly mutated into a baffling administrative nightmare. The contact number provided led to a deadline. The address was a transient, dilapidated apartment block where the paint peeled from the walls and no tenant recognized the name. Social workers expanded their radius, combing through electoral rolls, driver's license databases, and tax registries across the entire continent. The name was incredibly common, a purposeful stroke of deceptive genius. Investigators sifted through hundreds of men matching the description, cross-referencing locations and marital statuses. They knocked on doors from the affluent northern beaches to the gritty industrial suburbs. Each lead evaporated into the humid air. The man she described, a bank clerk who allegedly lived nearby, simply did not exist in the capacity she claimed. Under mounting pressure from increasingly suspicious authorities, her story began to mutate. The impenetrable armor showed hairline fractures. She claimed she had met the father through friends at a local pub, but could not name a single mutual acquaintance. She suggested they had a brief, passionate affair, yet could not recall exactly where they went, what he drank, or what kind of car he drove. The details were entirely devoid of texture or reality. Then, the name itself changed. Sitting in a stark interview room, she nonchalantly suggested that perhaps his last name was not Morris. It might have been Norris. Andrew Norris, this subtle, maddening pivot, forced investigators to start from scratch. The search parameters instantly doubled. The red herring was performing its intended function perfectly, mirroring the frantic, dead-end searches that plague complex cases. It consumed hundreds of hours of investigative manpower, draining state resources and stalling the momentum of the inquiry. She had sent the entire welfare apparatus chasing a shadow through a maze of paperwork. By late 1999, the Department of Community Services exhausted every administrative avenue. They realized they were not dealing with a misfiled custody arrangement. They were looking at a gaping hole where a 3-year-old girl should be. They officially referred the matter to the police. What began as a quiet welfare check transitioned into a formal missing persons investigation. Plainclothes detectives arrived at the affluent residence, piercing the bubble of respectability that had shielded the family for decades. The arrival of police in the manicured driveway sent immediate ripples of shock through the tight-knit neighborhood. Whispers began to circulate at the local rugby club. Her partner was blindsided, caught in a terrifying cognitive dissonance. The woman he shared a bed with was being investigated for a child he never knew existed. Investigators sat across from her, watching her demeanor closely. They noted the chilling absence of panic. A mother whose child cannot be located by the state should be terrified, demanding action, pleading for help. Instead, she was fiercely annoyed. She treated the seasoned detectives not as saviors looking for her daughter, but as bureaucratic pests interfering with her Olympic training schedule. She maintained the lie with a terrifying, hollow conviction. The child was with Andrew, and the police simply weren't looking hard enough. But the detectives understood the grim reality of the streets. Andrew Morris was a ghost, and ghosts do not raise children. Between 1992 and 1999, the Golden Girl of Manly had been pregnant 5 separate times. The scale of the deception was almost incomprehensible. 2 of these pregnancies were quietly terminated. 2 more resulted in full-term births and subsequent closed adoptions. Children handed over to the state with zero involvement or knowledge from her family. And then there was the 5th, the missing infant, Tegan. This was not an isolated panic response from a terrified young woman. This was a highly sophisticated, decade-long methodology. The physical discipline required to hide a full-term pregnancy once is monumental. To do it 5 times while competing in elite athletic brackets and wearing skin-tight lycra, it defied medical logic. Detectives systematically dismantled her social armor. They pulled her partner, Duncan Gillies, into an interrogation room. The rugged rugby union player sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights, staring blankly at the timeline the investigators laid out across the metal table. He was shown clinical charts proving the woman he slept next to had carried multiple children to term while they were intimately involved. He maintained absolute ignorance. The gaslighting had been so absolute, so meticulously managed, that he simply believed her athletic training was responsible for her fluctuating weight. Teammates, parents, and teaching colleagues echoed the exact same bewilderment. When the details of the investigation leaked into the affluent Northern Beaches community, the atmosphere mutated from shock to a deep, paranoid distrust. Whispers dominated the local clubs. If a respected physical education teacher could completely conceal 5 pregnancies and make an infant vanish without a trace, the fundamental fabric of their high society bubble was a lie. The community closed ranks, terrified of the scandal. Meanwhile, the crux of the police work, and the anchor dragging them into an administrative abyss, remained the hunt for the father, Andrew Morris, or Norris. A dedicated strike force was assembled to track down this phantom. It was the ultimate red herring, a smokescreen woven from a common name and a plausible modern custody arrangement. Investigators pulled electoral rolls for the entire country. They cross-referenced tax records, driver's licenses, and utility bills spanning thousands of miles. They subpoenaed bank statements and property leases in every surrounding suburb. Every single man bearing those names within a 10-year age bracket was located, background checked, and aggressively cleared. None had engaged in a brief affair with an elite athlete. None had taken custody of an infant in the fall of 1996. The task force chased shadows through bureaucratic archives for months. The frustration inside the precinct boiled over as thousands of state man-hours evaporated. It was a dead end deliberately constructed to buy the mother time. To prove premeditation, forensic accountants audited her life. They scoured credit card statements and bank logs from the months leading up to September 1996. They searched for a single receipt indicating maternal intent. There were no charges for a crib, no purchases of diapers, infant formula, or baby clothing. She had made absolutely zero logistical or financial preparations for bringing a child home. The absence of evidence became the core evidence of intent. As the nationwide search for the father collapsed, the pressure matrix entirely shifted onto the prime suspect. Police subjected her to grueling, hours-long interrogations. The audio recordings from these sessions are chilling in their emotional sterility. Detectives deployed every tactic in the manual, laying out the hospital logs, the contradictory timelines, the sheer impossibility of her narrative. She never cracked. She never screamed or broke down in tears. She simply sat with her arms crossed, radiating a cold, impenetrable stubbornness. When confronted with the undeniable fact that Andrew Morris did not exist, she did not waver. She calmly suggested the police were simply incompetent. She shifted the blame directly onto the state, insisting they were failing her daughter by not searching hard enough. Her narrative grew increasingly elaborate to fill the gaps exposed by detectives. She claimed she handed the infant over in a hospital parking lot, then amended it to a nearby street corner. The handover location shifted, the spelling of the father's name changed, the nature of their relationship mutated. But the central pillar of her defense remained immovable. She gave the baby to the biological father. Homicide detectives operate on a fundamental triad: body, weapon, scene. In this case, they possessed absolutely none. The infant had vanished into a brutal 3-hour window between Auburn Hospital and the Manly wedding reception. The route was heavily scoured. Police divers waded through the dark, freezing silt of the harbor and the murky currents of the Parramatta River, sweeping the depths for small remains. Cadaver dogs mapped the dense bushland along the highway corridor. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed at local municipal landfill sites. Nothing. Not a scrap of infant clothing. Not a hospital blanket. The earth had seemingly swallowed the child whole. Without a physical victim, proving murder requires an overwhelming avalanche of circumstantial evidence. Crown prosecutors knew that proving a mother lied to social workers was a minor offense. Proving she committed homicide without a drop of blood or a single eyewitness was a monumental legal gamble. So, they began building a case block by block, constructed entirely out of the mother's own lies. They charted her minute-by-minute movements. They documented her extreme motive, the impending Olympics, the pristine teaching career, the strict retired police father, the high-profile boyfriend. They established a clear, lethal pattern of treating her own fertility as a logistical problem to be covertly solved. Every hidden pregnancy, every adoption, every termination was presented as a precursor to the ultimate disposal. Yet, the investigation stalled, spun out, and rebooted repeatedly over the course of a grueling decade. The Golden Girl moved on with her life, securing new jobs, forming new relationships, effectively outswimming the law. For years, it seemed the facade would hold permanently. The authorities were paralyzed by a phantom father, a missing child, and a suspect who simply refused to break character. In 2010, the legal machinery finally cornered the former athlete. The Supreme Court trial was a high-wire act of circumstantial prosecution. The Crown had no physical remains, no murder weapon, no forensic crime scene. They possessed only the suffocating weight of her own deceptions. Prosecutors methodically dismantled the phantom father narrative. They painted a stark portrait of a woman who viewed her newborn not as a human being, but as an intolerable obstacle to her athletic ambitions and societal standing. The defense fought fiercely. They argued that handing an infant over to a secret lover was highly immoral, but it was certainly not murder. They hammered on the absent forensics, asserting you cannot convict someone of killing a child when you cannot definitively prove the child is dead. The jury deliberated for a grueling week. Ultimately, the foreman delivered the final crushing blow: guilty. The sentence was handed down, 18 years in a maximum security cell. The golden facade was instantly shattered. Recently enacted no body, no parole legislation firmly cemented her fate. The mandate is absolute. Until she breaks her silence and reveals the exact location of the remains, she will not breathe free air. The meticulous deception that once protected her is now the very thing keeping her locked in an 8x10 concrete cage. The pursuit of perfection is a dangerous obsession. For Kelly Lane, a meticulously constructed public image demanded the ultimate sacrifice, a human life traded for athletic glory and social approval. She chose the pristine white dress over her own flesh and blood. Today, she sits in a sterile concrete cell, her Olympic dreams long extinguished, and somewhere out there, in the unforgiving expanse of the Australian margins, a little girl named Tegan remains lost. The facade held for a decade. The silence will last an eternity. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A woman who legally did not exist walked into a Florida hardware store. She had no valid social security number, no real name, and no past. Yet the items she pushed across the counter were chillingly real: an electric carving knife, heavy-duty zip ties, and industrial garbage bags. At that exact moment, just a few miles away, a 34-year-old mother of 3 vanished without a trace. This is not a standard missing person case. It is the collision between a deeply rooted life and a total phantom, a predator operating under her 18th stolen identity. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Yulee, Florida sits in Nassau County, an area where the suffocating 90-degree humidity dictates a slow, predictable pace of life. It is a place where absolute anonymity is scarce. Jolene Cummings was the complete antithesis of a mystery. At 34, her world was anchored firmly by her 3 children. She was a fixture in the local landscape, a dedicated mother who worked grueling hours as a hairstylist to ensure her kids never went without. Her life was a meticulously documented open book. Her days were measured by the familiar beats of school drop-offs, the constant drone of blow dryers at the salon, and weekend family gatherings. Jolene's digital footprint was vibrant, packed with milestones and candid photos. Her physical footprint was just as solid. She was surrounded by a protective network of family, including a fiercely loyal mother who spoke to her daily. Jolene lived entirely in the light. She had no secrets that required hiding. 2 feet away, operating the styling chair right next to Jolene, stood her exact opposite. The woman was known to the salon and the state of Florida as Jennifer Seibert, but the real Jennifer Seibert had been buried in a Pennsylvania cemetery since 1987, the victim of a tragic traffic accident. The woman sweeping hair off the linoleum floor was a phantom named Kimberly Lee Kessler. Kessler's existence was a masterclass in evasion. Born in Butler, Pennsylvania, she had intentionally orchestrated her own erasure. Around 2004, she simply walked out of her legitimate life and vanished into the transient underbelly of the American highway system. For the next 2 decades, Kessler became a ghost. She carved a jagged, untraceable path through 33 cities across 14 states. She didn't just move, she metamorphosed. She utilized at least 18 different aliases, names like Mia Stone, Pamela Kleber, and finally, Seibert. Her methodology was calculated and cold. Kessler would scour local graveyards or archive obituaries, hunting for girls born around her own birth year who had died young. She would hijack their identities, forging social security cards and driver's licenses, just convincing enough to pass a rudimentary background check for a low-level, cash-paying job. Kessler's entire universe was confined to the interior of a black Kia Soul. The vehicle served as a mobile command center and a fortress of intense paranoia. Inside the cramped cabin, she hoarded the tools of a professional fugitive. prepaid burner phones, a lockbox of forged identification documents, and spiral notebooks filled with frantic, disjointed handwriting. She possessed no legitimate bank accounts, owned no property, and paid for every gallon of gas and cheap motel room in untraceable cash. To sustain a lie of this magnitude requires exhausting, relentless hypervigilance. Every casual workplace conversation was a potential interrogation. Every friendly question about her hometown or her family was a trap waiting to be sprung. Kessler shed her aliases like dead skin the moment she suspected someone was looking too closely. She formed zero genuine human attachments. Instead, she continuously formulated exit strategies, ready to pack the Kia and burn rubber toward a new state line in the dead of night. Eventually, the highway brought her to Fernandina Beach. Under the stolen identity of Jennifer Seibert, she secured a chair at Tangle's hair salon. To the casual observer, it was just two women working side by side in a bustling local business. But the reality was a volatile psychological mismatch. Jolene was perceptive, grounded, and surrounded by people who paid attention to her. Kessler was a paranoid drifter, terrified of being truly seen. The heavy gravity of Jolene's authentic life was now operating inches away from the fragile, fabricated vacuum of Kessler's lies. Tangles. Hair salon was a confined ecosystem. The layout forced stylists into an intimate proximity, sharing mirrors, sinks, and breathing the same chemically heavy air. A constant, suffocating fog of aerosol hairspray, synthetic coconut shampoo, and stinging ammonia. In this brightly lit, mirrored box in Fernandina Beach, evasion was nearly impossible. You heard every conversation. You saw every micro-expression in the reflection of the glass. For Jolene, this environment was completely natural. She thrived on the chatter, effortlessly building rapport with clients, sharing anecdotes about her 3 children, her upcoming 34th birthday, her weekend plans. She was a woman anchored in reality, moving through her days with a loud, unapologetic authenticity. For the woman calling herself Jennifer Seibert, the salon was a daily, agonizing minefield. When Kessler secured the chair next to Jolene in late February, she presented the standard, muted template she had honed over the years. She was quiet, aggressively private, and wore dark, heavy clothes that deliberately obscured her frame despite the sweltering Florida heat. She kept her head down, aggressively sweeping floors, wiping down counters with rigid, repetitive motions, and avoiding prolonged eye contact. She requested her wages in cash, bypassing the standard payroll system. She deflected even the most basic inquiries about her life. To the salon owner and casual clients, she was just an eccentric, reliable worker who kept to herself, a harmless oddity. But Jolene was highly perceptive. Working 2 feet away from someone for 40 hours a week breeds a specific kind of familiarity, a rhythm you cannot fake. Jolene began to notice the jagged, unnatural edges of her coworkers' fabricated reality. The cracks in the facade were subtle at first, manifesting in Kessler's physical behavior. Jolene noted the way the new hire recoiled from smartphone cameras. In an era where stylists constantly documented their work for social media, Kessler actively dodged lenses, ducking out of the frame or raising a hand to her face whenever a client or coworker snapped a photo. Then came the conversational slip-ups. A transient who has burned through 18 identities struggles to maintain a consistent regional backstory. A casual mention of a childhood memory wouldn't align with the geography of Pennsylvania, the state where the real Jennifer Seibert was buried. A reference to a past employer or a local landmark would immediately lead to a dead end. Jolene, naturally inquisitive and talkative, would ask basic, harmless follow-up questions. She would casually press for details, trying to connect with the woman at the next station. Normal questions for a coworker, lethal interrogations for a phantom. Kessler's psychological state began to warp under the perceived pressure. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades looking over her shoulder, biologically conditioned to view curiosity as a direct existential threat. In the reflection of the long styling mirrors, Kessler watched Jolene. She scrutinized the younger woman's interactions, listening intently to the background noise of Jolene's phone calls, analyzing every laugh and whispered comment. The paranoia festered in the tight confines of the workspace. Kessler became convinced that Jolene was investigating her, that the mother of three was slowly unspooling the thread that would unravel her entire life. The tension between the two chairs thickened, turning the air in the salon brittle. Indirect accounts from those who frequented the shop described a palpable, heavy chill between their stations. Jolene confided in friends and regular clients that there was something deeply wrong with the new girl. She mentioned that her coworker made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She caught the older woman staring at her in the mirror with a flat, predatory expression, eyes completely devoid of warmth. Jolene wasn't just passively observing, she was actively pushing back against the bizarre behavior, refusing to be intimidated in her own workspace. She made it abundantly clear she was not buying the act. By early May, the dynamic had shifted from merely awkward to silently hostile. Kessler realized that Jolene was not going to let the inconsistencies slide. For someone whose freedom depended entirely on absolute anonymity, this realization was catastrophic. If Jolene pushed too hard, if she typed the name Jennifer Seibert into the right public records database, she would find an obituary from 1987. She would discover that the social security number provided to the salon belonged to a dead teenager. She would expose the fraud, bringing local law enforcement right to the salon's front door, triggering the collapse of a 22-year run. Historically, Kessler's response to this level of heat was to flee. She would pack the black Kia Soul under the cover of darkness and vanish across a state line. But something had changed. Perhaps she had anchored herself too deeply in Nassau County. Perhaps the mental exhaustion of running for over 8,000 days had finally snapped her internal circuit board. Whatever the catalyst, her ingrained flight response mutated into a cold, calculated fight response. The physical environment of the salon only amplified the claustrophobia of their impending collision. The relentless buzzing of hair clippers, the high-pitched whine of blow dryers, the metallic snip of shears. These ordinary sounds masked a silent, psychological war of attrition. Kessler was no longer just sweeping floors. She was pacing her cage. She began mentally mapping the salon's vulnerabilities, taking inventory of the layout, the closing procedures, the exact times when the building emptied out and the locks were turned. Jolene simply wanted to do her job and go home to her kids. Kessler, driven by a cornered animal's desperation, was preparing for an execution. May 12, 2018, the Saturday before Mother's Day. In Ulay, the morning broke with a thick, 85-degree heat that clung to the asphalt of the strip mall parking lot. Jolene maneuvered her beige Ford Expedition into her usual spot. She was entering a weekend loaded with anticipation. Tomorrow was Mother's Day, and Monday was her 34th birthday. Her schedule was completely booked. She stepped through the glass doors of Tangle's hair salon, bringing the dense Florida humidity in with her. Immediately greeted by the familiar, overwhelming olfactory mix of the beauty industry, sharp ammonia from hair dye, the cloying sweetness of artificial coconut shampoo, and the acrid burn of aerosol hairspray settling onto the linoleum floor. For the first 6 hours of the shift, the salon functioned as a high-volume echo chamber. The layout of the shop offered zero privacy. Styling stations lined the walls, spaced mere feet apart, forcing conversations to bleed into one another. The ambient noise was a continuous, deafening hum. 4 blow dryers running simultaneously. The rapid, metallic snip of shears. The buzzing vibration of electric clippers. Above it all was the constant, overlapping chatter of women discussing weekend plans, children, and neighborhood gossip. Jolene operated in her element. She moved seamlessly around her chair, her focus split between the clients in the mirror and the clock on the wall. She was scheduled to clock out at 5. Her ex-husband was set to drop off their 3 children late that afternoon at a local retail parking lot. She had a strict itinerary. At the adjacent station, Kimberly Kessler functioned like a machine running on a failing battery. The contrast was stark. While Jolene engaged in loud, animated conversations, Kessler remained rigidly silent. She wore her standard dark, oversized clothing, a physical barrier against the bright fluorescent lights overhead. To the clients in the waiting area, she appeared deeply focused on her work, but internally, Kessler was redlining. The psychological pressure of the past few weeks had reached an unsustainable critical mass. Every time Jolene laughed with a client, Kessler's eyes flicked to the mirror. Every time Jolene picked up her smartphone to check a text message, Kessler's muscles tensed, convinced the younger woman was running a background check, typing the name Jennifer Seibert into a public database, or texting local authorities. The paranoia was no longer just a creeping dread. It had calcified into an absolute physical certainty. Kessler firmly believed her 22-year run was seconds away from termination. Her 18 aliases, the thousands of miles logged in her black Kia Soul, the meticulous avoidance of the grid, all of it was about to be destroyed by a talkative mother of 3 working 2 feet away. By 4 in the afternoon, the manic energy of the Saturday rush began to bleed out of the building. The overlapping conversations dwindled. The loud hum of the blow dryers was replaced by the softer, rhythmic sound of brooms sweeping hair into neat piles. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long, harsh shadows through the front display windows. At 4:45, the final client paid in cash and pushed through the glass door. The bell above the frame chimed once, then the heavy door swung shut. The lock engaged with a sharp, metallic click. The sudden absence of noise in the salon was absolute. The deafening hum of the day evaporated, leaving behind a brittle, suffocating silence. Only Jolene and Kessler remained inside. Jolene moved efficiently, wiping down her station, organizing her shears, entirely focused on getting to her Ford Expedition to meet her kids. She was standing in the narrow space between her chair and the back break room. Kessler stopped sweeping. The transition from flight to fight occurred in a fraction of a second. The exact catalyst remains locked in the silent room. Perhaps Jolene made a final, passing comment about the glaring holes in her coworker's background. Perhaps she just looked at her the wrong way in the mirror. For a cornered predator whose entire existence relies on a fabricated reality, the motive was pure, desperate self-preservation. The illusion of Jennifer Seibert had to survive. Jolene Cummings had to be erased. The pacing of the room violently fractured. High tension, minimal movement, then explosive kinetic force. Kessler moved. She closed the 2-foot gap between their stations. The attack was swift, brutal, and utterly silent. There were no screams recorded by neighboring businesses, no signs of a prolonged, chaotic struggle that would shatter the front windows or overturn heavy furniture. Kessler utilized the element of absolute surprise. Jolene, caught completely off guard while organizing her tools, had no time to mount a defensive counterattack. The assault drove her backward toward the sinks and the break room doorway. The linoleum, slick with aerosol residue and loose hair, offered no traction. Blood forcefully broke the sterile environment of the salon. It sprayed across the baseboards. It pooled near the styling chair. It smeared against the lower half of the walls as Jolene was driven down to the floor. The exact mechanics of the murder were swallowed by the room, but forensic experts would later reconstruct a scene of intense, localized violence. A blunt force impact, a sudden, lethal struggle confined to a few square feet of space. Within minutes, the mother of 3 lay dead on the salon floor. Kessler stood over the body. Her chest heaved. Her hands were covered in her coworker's blood. Her face bore fresh, angry scratches, the final, desperate defensive marks left by Jolene's fingernails. The adrenaline spike crashed, leaving behind a cold, sociopathic clarity. Kessler did not panic. She did not grab her keys and flee the state. Instead, she pivoted immediately to the methodology of erasure. She had spent 2 decades making her own identity disappear. Now, she simply applied that exact same skill set to a physical body. She moved to the back room and retrieved the supplies she had purchased days earlier at the local hardware store. The heavy-duty, industrial-strength garbage bags, the thick plastic zip ties, the electric carving knife. The quiet of the locked salon was broken only by the sound of Kessler's boots moving across the slick floor. She worked with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. She bound the remains. She encased them in the thick, opaque plastic, pulling the zip ties tight to seal the bags, ensuring no biological material would leak during transport. The physical weight of an adult human is substantial, roughly 130 pounds of dead weight that is incredibly difficult to maneuver. Kessler dragged the heavy plastic packages toward the rear exit, leaving long, distinct smear patterns through the pooling blood on the linoleum. Once the body was secured and hidden out of sight, Phase 2 commenced. Environmental decontamination. Kessler retrieved industrial bleach, ammonia, and heavy-duty floor cleaners from the utility closet. For the next several hours, she systematically dismantled the crime scene. She scrubbed the baseboards until her knuckles ached. She wiped down the vinyl styling chairs. She poured raw bleach directly onto the floor, using heavy towels to soak up the diluted blood, violently scrubbing away the biological footprint of the violence. The acrid chemical burn of bleach rapidly overpowered the lingering scents of coconut shampoo and hairspray, creating a toxic atmosphere inside the locked room. She worked into the deep hours of the evening, a phantom meticulously scrubbing away the reality of what had just occurred. She gathered the blood-soaked towels, Jolene's personal items, and her own soiled clothing, stuffing them into separate trash bags. By the time Kessler finally unlocked the back door and stepped out into the humid Florida night, the interior of Tangle's hair salon appeared completely undisturbed. The chairs were aligned. The floor was mopped. To a casual observer walking past the front window, it was just an empty business waiting for Monday morning. But Jolene Cummings was gone. Her Ford Expedition remained sitting in the dark parking lot, and a woman who did not exist was dragging a series of heavy black bags toward her vehicle, preparing to make a human being vanish as completely as she had vanished herself. Saturday, May 12th, 5 p.m. The late afternoon sun beat heavily against the asphalt of a designated retail parking lot in Ulay. Jolene's ex-husband sat idling in his vehicle, the air conditioning struggling against the 85-degree humidity. The custody handoff was a strict, unbending routine. Jolene was notoriously punctual, a woman whose entire internal clock revolved around the logistical needs of her 3 children. 10 minutes passed, then 30. The beige Ford Expedition never crested the horizon. He dialed her cell phone. The call rang out, eventually dropping to an automated voicemail, a sterile, robotic voice replacing the typically vibrant mother. Subsequent text messages hung in the digital void, completely unanswered. As the evening bled into the muggy Florida night, the frustration in the parking lot mutated into a cold, sinking dread. This was an extreme deviation from the victim's baseline behavior. By Sunday morning, the dread had escalated into full-blown panic. It was May 13th, Mother's Day. For a woman whose identity was fiercely anchored by her children, missing this specific holiday was an immediate, glaring siren. Jolene's mother, Anne, knew instantly that the timeline was broken and the reality she inhabited had just fractured. She contacted the Nassau County Sheriff's Office. She explicitly informed the dispatchers that her daughter's vehicle was missing. Her phone was dead, and she would absolutely never, under any circumstances, voluntarily walk away from her family on Mother's Day. Law enforcement traditionally mandates a waiting period for missing adults, anticipating they will resurface. However, the rigid, documented reliability of the victim forced an immediate acceleration of protocol. A missing person bulletin was pushed through dispatch channels, and the search grid was activated. The social echo in Yulee was instantaneous and suffocating. Nassau County is a region where absolute anonymity is an illusion. Everyone is separated by a single degree of connection. By Monday morning, the local digital space was saturated with photographs of the smiling 34-year-old. Missing posters were rapidly taped to the glass doors of convenience stores, gas pumps, and community bulletin boards. The atmosphere in the town underwent a rapid, heavy shift. Weekend complacency dissolved into a tense, vibrating paranoia. Neighbors looked at each other with quiet suspicion. The hum of casual grocery store gossip was replaced by heavy, speculative whispers. Residents double-checked their deadbolts. Jolene was universally liked and highly visible. The community understood implicitly that a mother of 3 does not evaporate. Someone in their orbit knew exactly what had happened. The first tangible break in the mystery surfaced 48 hours later. On Tuesday, May 15th, a patrol cruiser scanning the commercial sectors located the missing beige Ford Expedition. It was parked haphazardly in the vast, sun-baked lot of a local Home Depot, just a few miles from Tangle's hair salon. The vehicle was locked. There were no keys inside, no obvious signs of a struggle within the cabin, and zero physical trace of its owner. Investigators immediately requisitioned the security footage from the hardware store's exterior cameras. They rewound the digital files, scanning the timestamps, looking for the exact moment the heavy SUV entered the frame. They found it. The timestamp read, Sunday, May 13th, 1:17 a.m. The expedition rolled into the harsh, illuminated glow of the sodium parking lights. It eased into a spot, the headlights cut out, and the driver's side door swung open. The figure that stepped onto the pavement was not Jolene. The low-resolution cameras captured a person clad entirely in black, wearing a dark hood pulled tight to deliberately obscure any facial features. But physical movement is distinct, almost like a fingerprint. The figure moved with a stiff, calculated marching gait. The individual did not look around, did not hesitate, and walked deliberately out of the camera's field of view, melting seamlessly into the dense, humid night. Detectives now possessed a specific timestamp and a physical profile. They turned their attention back to the victim's last known location, the hair salon. When Monday morning had arrived, the other stylist opened the shop to a wall of harsh chemical odor. The stinging scent of industrial bleach completely overpowered the usual salon smells. They noticed items were missing from Jolene's station, and the new hire, Jennifer Seibert, had failed to show up for her shift. She had simply stopped existing. The address she provided on her employment paperwork was a complete dead end. Her phone number was disconnected. The Phantom had initiated her extraction protocol. Kessler's execution, while cold and brutal, was deeply flawed. She had spent hours in the locked salon scrubbing the linoleum, convinced she had eradicated the biological evidence of her crime. She relied on the overpowering stench of ammonia to mask the violence. When crime scene technicians breached the salon after hours and locked down the building, the chemical fumes still burned the back of their throats. To the naked eye, the workspace between the two chairs was pristine, but human blood is notoriously resilient. Technicians sprayed the styling area with luminol, extinguishing the overhead fluorescent lights. In the pitch black of the salon, the chemical reaction was immediate and terrifying. The floor illuminated in a bright, glowing blue. The reaction outlined broad, sweeping smear marks where a heavy mass had been dragged toward the rear exit. The biological glow splattered against the baseboards and traced a chaotic, violent path across the lower cabinets. Kessler had wiped away the red, but she left behind the exact geometric footprint of a murder. The investigation was no longer just a search for a missing mother. It was a manhunt for a killer who legally did not exist. Law enforcement was not just tracking a suspect. They were hunting a ghost who had a 48-hour head start, a vehicle packed with forged documents, and a 2-decade history of vanishing without a single trace. Detectives hit an immediate concrete wall. The employment file pulled from the salon manager's desk offered a name, a birth date, and a 9-digit social security number. But when investigators routed that sequence through federal databases, the system kicked back a stark anomaly. The number legally belonged to a teenager who had perished in a traffic collision in Pennsylvania in 1987. The woman who had been sweeping hair and chatting with clients in Nassau County was a total phantom. The investigation violently shifted from a local missing person inquiry to a multi-agency federal manhunt. The FBI and U.S. Marshals integrated with county detectives. They had a prime suspect, but they had absolutely no idea who she actually was. Analysts dug into the digital void, tracking prepaid cell phone pings and pulling automated license plate reader data across state lines. The primary target was the black Kia Soul. As forensic accountants and cyber teams tore into the background of the salon worker, the sheer scale of her deception materialized. Law enforcement mapped a chaotic web of temporary addresses, forged driver's licenses, and cash-only transactions stretching from the Midwest to the Deep South. Each time agents tracked down a previous address or a former employer, the trail went instantly cold. It was a labyrinth intentionally designed to exhaust pursuit. The fugitive lived entirely off the grid, leaving behind no tax records, no registered vehicles under a real name, and zero digital footprint. To identify her, federal agents had to bypass the paper trail entirely and rely on legacy biometric databases. Running her fingerprints through national criminal justice servers finally yielded a definitive hit. The ghost had a name, Kimberly Lee Kessler. She had been unaccounted for out of Butler, Pennsylvania since 2004. but maintaining a ghost protocol requires absolute perfection. The adrenaline of the brutal execution had finally caused the phantom to slip. The breakthrough arrived on May 16th, 4 days after the salon doors locked. A highway license plate reader pinged the dark SUV traveling south on Interstate 95. Tactical units deployed rapidly, their focus zeroing in on an isolated rest area in St. Johns County. The takedown was swift and heavily militarized. Law enforcement cordons sealed off the perimeter, tactical teams moving in on the parked vehicle idling under the oppressive afternoon sun. Inside the sweltering cabin, Kessler was asleep. She was surrounded by the chaotic remnants of her fractured life, piles of dark clothing, spiral notebooks filled with erratic handwriting, multiple burner phones, and survival gear. When agents breached the doors, dragging her onto the asphalt, the woman offered zero physical resistance. The 22-year run ended on a stretch of hot pavement. But the brutal toll of the previous Saturday was written directly on her skin. Her face was marred by deep, angry scratches, raw, unhealed defensive wounds carving tracks across her cheeks and forehead. One eye was severely bruised and swollen shut. The victim had fought back fiercely in the narrow space between the styling chairs. Inside the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Kessler employed the same flat, aggressive silence she used in the workplace. She refused to confirm her legal identity. She stared blankly at the concrete block wall, her expression completely devoid of humanity. When pressed about the location of the missing mother, she simply invoked her right to counsel and shut down. Detectives were sitting across from a brick wall. With the suspect in custody and refusing to speak, the investigative focus pivoted entirely to recovering the remains. Detectives re-examined the timeline, tracing the Kia Soul's movements immediately following the frantic cleanup phase. Surveillance footage pulled from neighboring commercial strips caught the vehicle making a calculated stop behind a local retail complex. The SUV idled near a row of heavy commercial dumpsters under the cover of darkness. Sanitation records confirmed a devastating reality. Those specific bins were emptied by waste management trucks shortly after that weekend. The contents were hydraulically compacted, transferred into long-haul trailers, and transported across the state line to the sprawling Chesser Island landfill in southern Georgia. The realization hit the task force with a heavy, sickening weight. The search grid shifted from the dense Florida foliage to a towering, toxic mountain of decomposing refuse. The logistics of a commercial landfill search are staggering and biologically hazardous. Over a grueling 33-day period, more than 400 searchers converged on the Georgia site. Teams consisting of specialized K-9 units, forensic anthropologists, and hazardous material crews operated under a brutal, relentless summer sun. The ambient temperature frequently spiked above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, creating an unbearable atmosphere of methane and decay. They systematically sifted through more than 3.3 million pounds of compacted garbage. Using GPS data from the sanitation trucks, engineers gridded off specific quadrants of the massive facility. Excavators with heavy steel claws peeled back layers of rotting organic waste, medical debris, and industrial sludge. Agents in heavy protective gear and breathing respirators meticulously raked through the material by hand. They were hunting for the specific heavy-duty garbage bags, the industrial zip ties, or any physical debris linked to the crime scene. The physical and mental toll on the search teams was immense. They battled severe heat exhaustion, navigating a landscape of sheer rot in a desperate bid to bring a mother back to her family. Despite the unprecedented scale and agonizing labor of the operation, the landfill refused to yield its core secret. Weeks of excavation produced circumstantial debris, items confirming Kessler's presence and purchases. But the sheer volume of waste, combined with the extreme pressure of the hydraulic compactors, made biological recovery virtually impossible. The physical body was never recovered. The void left behind in the community was absolute. Yet the absence of remains did not paralyze the judicial machinery. Detectives meticulously compiled the peripheral evidence: the glowing blue chemical footprint left on the linoleum floor, the GPS timeline, the damning receipts from the hardware store detailing the purchase of the electric carving knife and heavy-duty bags, the fresh defensive wounds etched into the suspect's face. Law enforcement had constructed an impenetrable wall of circumstantial proof. They knew the exact sequence of events that occurred inside that locked building. The challenge now shifted entirely to the courtroom, convicting a phantom for a murder with no body. In December 2021, the state of Florida finally brought the Phantom to trial. Kimberly Kessler's courtroom behavior was a volatile extension of her long evasion strategy: chaotic, disruptive, and fiercely uncooperative. She repeatedly shouted over the proceedings, forcing bailiffs to remove her from the floor. She watched the remainder of her trial through the thick glass of a holding cell. The prosecution lacked a physical body, so they built a mechanical, airtight timeline instead. The jury absorbed the harsh, glowing luminol photographs captured inside the salon. They scrutinized the hardware store records and the time-stamped surveillance footage of the abandoned Ford Expedition. Medical examiners detailed the specific mechanics of the defensive wounds etched into the defendant's skin. The circumstantial evidence formed a complete, inescapable trap. It took the jury barely an hour to deliberate. Kessler was found guilty of first-degree murder and immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The transient, who had spent over 8,000 days shedding identities, forging documents, and crossing state borders, was permanently anchored to a single concrete box. The legal system ensured she would never vanish again. For 22 years, Kimberly Kessler stole the names of dead women to walk among the living. She traded 18 identities for the ultimate cost of one vibrant, irreplaceable life. Jolene Cummings was everything the Phantom was not: seen, loved, and deeply rooted. While a concrete cell now permanently anchors the woman with no face, the heavy Florida heat remains unchanged, leaving 3 young children to navigate a reality forever fractured by a predator who legally never existed. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A 24-year-old insurance broker lay dead in the hallway of his New Hampshire condo, executed with a single hollow point bullet to the head. His blood soaked into the pristine white carpet. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. A few feet away, his young widow wept for the arriving police, but the tears vanished the second the television cameras turned off. She was a high school media coordinator, and she treated her husband's brutal assassination like a student film project. She didn't just want him dead, she wanted to direct it. Derry, New Hampshire, in the late 1980s, was a quintessential blue-collar town where local ambitions usually mirrored the steady, predictable pace of New England life. Gregory Smart fit seamlessly into this landscape. Born in 1965, he was an easygoing young man with a deep affinity for heavy metal music and a remarkably laid-back approach to his future. Friends knew him as a fiercely loyal companion who spent his weekends playing guitar and socializing. He was fundamentally a pragmatist. Realizing that rock and roll wouldn't pay the bills, he eventually settled into a practical career as a regional insurance broker. It was a job that promised stability, a quiet, comfortable existence that he was entirely content to accept. Pamela Woyes was wired differently. Raised in Miami before her family relocated to the Northeast, she possessed an intense, almost manic drive to be noticed. She despised the idea of a quiet suburban life. Her eyes were permanently fixed on a larger screen, idolizing national broadcast journalists and aggressively pursuing a career in television media. During her time at Florida State University, she hosted a college radio show focusing on the same heavy metal scene that Greg loved. This shared musical interest became the initial anchor for their relationship. But while he enjoyed the music for its rebellion, she viewed her involvement in the scene as a stepping stone to a broadcast career. She meticulously crafted her image to match her lofty aspirations. Every outfit was tailored, her hair was teased to perfection, and her public interactions were heavily curated. She was ambitious, highly articulate, and fiercely protective of her persona. To her, reality was merely raw footage waiting to be edited into a compelling narrative. When the two began dating seriously, their dynamic was perplexing to outside observers. He was the relaxed rocker. She was the hyper-focused overachiever. Yet, they seemed to balance each other. Under her influence, he softened his rebellious edges, eventually cutting his signature long hair and adopting the polished, professional look she demanded. They married in May of 1989, settling down in a modest, newly built condominium unit in Derry. To their neighbors, they appeared to be a perfectly upwardly mobile young couple, rapidly checking off the boxes of the modern American dream. While Greg comfortably settled into his insurance roots, the new Mrs. Smart pursued her media ambitions with ruthless efficiency. She accepted a position as the media coordinator at Winnacunnet High School, located 20 miles away in the coastal town of Hampton. The role tasked her with directing the school's regional broadcasting initiative, an ironic acronym known as Project SMAGRT, which stood for Students Making a Right Track. Her daily responsibilities involved teaching teenagers how to operate complex camera equipment, produce local public access programming, and build self-esteem through media exposure. For a woman who envisioned herself reading the evening news on a national network, managing a high school media lab felt like a severe professional downgrade. It was a windowless room filled with outdated electronics and awkward adolescents. However, she quickly discovered an unexpected advantage in this cramped studio. Among the teenagers, she was an absolute celebrity. She positioned herself not as a traditional faculty member, but as a hip, young mentor who understood their struggles better than their parents did. The high school environment provided her with a captive, easily manipulated audience. The boys, in particular, looked up to her with a mixture of reverence and adolescent infatuation, desperate for her approval and eager for her attention. In that small broadcasting room, surrounded by tripods and microphones, she finally secured the absolute power and unwavering adoration she craved. The school studio became her private kingdom, and the students were slowly being groomed into her compliant, unquestioning caste. The veneer of the perfect suburban marriage cracked before the ink on their wedding certificate was entirely dry. By the winter of 1989, the stark reality of paying a mortgage on a regional insurance broker's salary had thoroughly extinguished any romantic illusions the new bride might have harbored. Greg was entirely content with quiet nights on their newly purchased furniture and weekends spent with a close circle of old friends. His wife was chronically restless, suffocated by the mundane routine of domestic predictability. The fatal fracture occurred when Greg confessed to a brief, meaningless infidelity. Instead of seeking counseling or initiating a legal separation, his wife weaponized the transgression. She used the affair to seize complete moral high ground within the home, utilizing it as a constant psychological bludgeon to remind him of his failure. But beneath her displays of righteous anger, a much colder calculation was taking shape. A rational person in her position might have simply filed for divorce. She vehemently rejected that option. She complained bitterly to her close confidants that a legal separation would ruin her financially. She adamantly refused to surrender the pristine condominium she had spent months meticulously decorating. She was terrified of losing custody of her beloved Shih Tzu, Halen. Above all, she deeply feared the social embarrassment of a failed marriage. She had spent years crafting an image of flawless success. She did not want to be a 22-year-old divorcee working a low-paying public school job. She preferred the tragic, untouchable status of a grieving widow. With her marriage emotionally dead, her focus shifted entirely to the windowless broadcasting room at Winnacunnet High School. Among the teenagers she supervised in the media lab, one boy stood out as exceptionally vulnerable. William Flynn, known to everyone as Billy, was a 15-year-old sophomore from a deeply fractured home. He was a quiet, insecure kid, eager to please and desperately searching for a stabilizing force in his chaotic adolescence. He was the perfect clay for a master manipulator. The grooming process was methodical, heavily masked at first as academic mentorship. She started by granting the teenager special privileges during school hours, elevating him above his peers in the video production class. Soon, the attention breached all professional boundaries. She offered him long rides home in her Honda CRX, blasting heavy metal cassettes and confiding in him as if he were an adult equal rather than a sophomore. For a socially awkward 15-year-old boy, the undivided attention of a glamorous, authoritative older woman was nothing short of intoxicating. By early 1990, the psychological manipulation escalated into a calculated sexual seduction. She began inviting the teenager to her Derry condo. During the midday hours, she knew Greg was miles away working his insurance routes. She transformed herself into the absolute center of the boy's universe, weaving maternal care with forbidden romance. Billy fell under a state of blinding obsession. He viewed his media teacher not just as a lover, but as an infallible deity who had miraculously elevated him from a high school nobody to her chosen protector. She understood that isolating the boy entirely might eventually raise red flags, so she proactively expanded her psychological net to include his closest friends. Teenagers Pete Randall, J.R. Latheim, and Vance Latham were quickly absorbed into her orbit. She effectively turned her home into a private, unsupervised clubhouse for the teenage misfits. She provided them with cigarettes, facilitated access to restricted movies, and created an environment devoid of traditional adult rules. She positioned herself as the cool older sister, the permissive den mother, and the undisputed leader of their pack. She held total authority, and the boys were completely captivated by her proximity and her rebellious aura. With her loyal, highly impressionable cast assembled, the media director began writing the script for her husband's demise. She started feeding Billy a steady diet of dark fabrications, painting Greg as a violent monster. She told the teenager that her husband was physically abusive, that she lived in constant, suffocating terror, and that she was trapped in an inescapable nightmare. It was a masterclass in predatory psychological warfare. She knew exactly which emotional levers to pull to trigger a 15-year-old's protective, heroic instincts. When the teenager naturally suggested she pack her bags and leave the abusive home, she immediately shut the idea down. She reiterated her financial anxieties and her absolute refusal to surrender her dog or her carefully curated assets to a man she despised. She planted the seed of violence so deeply and so carefully that it eventually felt, to the boy, like his own desperate conclusion. She convinced him that the only obstacle standing between them and a lifetime of uninterrupted happiness was Greg's pulse. The manipulation reached its critical apex when she issued a chilling, final ultimatum. She coldly informed the desperately infatuated sophomore that if he truly loved her, if he possessed the courage to save her and be with her forever, he would have to eliminate the problem permanently. If he lacked the nerve, she promised to end their relationship immediately and banish him from her life forever. Faced with the unimaginable threat of losing his goddess, the 15-year-old boy agreed to commit murder. The subsequent planning phase was surreal in its casual, suburban banality. The teenagers sat around the living room, smoking cigarettes and snacking, while their teacher laid out the operational parameters of an assassination. She instructed them on how to forcefully enter the home and stage the scene to mimic a botched burglary. She demanded they steal her husband's jewelry and ransack the drawers to make the motive look authentic to local police. Most chillingly, as she finalized the details of the hit, she gave her student assassins one absolute, non-negotiable directive regarding the execution itself. They were strictly forbidden from shooting her husband on her brand new white leather couch. She simply didn't want the upholstery ruined by the blood. The 1st of May, 1990 was chosen with clinical precision. The mastermind required a flawless, impenetrable alibi to distance herself from the violent reality of her own plan. That evening, she drove 20 miles to the coastal town of Hampton to attend a routine school board meeting, a bureaucratic gathering guaranteed to be packed with reliable, professional witnesses. Before leaving her Derry condominium, she made one critical adjustment to the property's security. She unlocked the heavy wooden bulkhead doors leading down into the basement. It was a deliberate, invisible vulnerability, engineered from the inside, leaving the fortress open for the invading force. By nightfall, the residential complex was wrapped in the quiet, predictable stillness of a suburban New Hampshire evening. A vehicle idled down the street, headlights killed, blending into the shadows. Inside sat the getaway driver, a high schooler tasked with waiting out the execution. Two figures detached themselves from the car and slipped through the manicured yards. William Flynn and Pete Randall were teenagers acting as foot soldiers in a psychosexual fantasy, operating under the absolute authority of a woman who had completely colonized their minds. They located the basement bulkhead exactly where they were promised it would be. The hinges opened silently. The boys descended into the pitch-black subterranean level, creeping up the narrow wooden stairs and slipping into the kitchen. The air inside the condo was stagnant and warm. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the refrigerator. The wait was agonizing. Time stretched, warping under the crushing pressure of adrenaline and fear. Billy gripped a heavy, stolen .38 caliber revolver. His palms were slick with sweat, slipping against the checkered grip of the weapon. He was a high school sophomore, standing in the dark, waiting to assassinate a man who had never done him any harm. Pete paced silently beside him, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a hunting knife. Every passing set of headlights reflecting against the living room walls sent violent spikes of panic through their nervous systems. They avoided the pristine white leather couch, treating the furniture like a minefield. The psychological weight of their teacher's final ultimatum pressed down on them in the suffocating dark. Approaching 10 o'clock, the atmosphere shifted. The low rumble of an engine pulling into the driveway, the distinct scrape of tires on asphalt, the heavy thud of a car door slamming shut. Footsteps echoed on the concrete walkway. Keys jingled, the deadbolt clicked, and the front door swung open. Greg stepped into the foyer, shedding the deep exhaustion of a long day driving insurance routes. He never had a chance to reach for the light switch. Pete lunged from the peripheral shadows. The ambush was fast, clumsy, and brutally violent. He drove his weight into the older man, pinning him backward against the wall and pressing the cold steel of the hunting knife hard against his throat. The sudden, explosive violence stripped away the homeowner's ability to fight back. Greg was violently forced down onto his knees in the narrow hallway. The darkness was absolute. The confusion was total. Pinned to the carpet, the insurance broker began to beg for his life. Through breathless, terrified gasps, he told the masked intruders that they could take absolutely anything they wanted. He offered them his wallet, his credit cards, his car keys. He frantically promised that he would not go to the authorities, swearing that he just wanted to survive the night. As the edge of the blade bit harder into his neck, Greg desperately offered the ultimate symbol of the marriage that was currently orchestrating his death. He told the teenagers to take his wedding ring. It was a tragic, desperate irony, trying to purchase his life with the very symbol his wife so deeply despised. Billy stood over the kneeling man. The .38 caliber revolver shook violently in his grip. The cold, mechanical reality of murder suddenly collided with the romanticized fantasy he had been sold in the high school media lab. Hesitation paralyzed his finger. He froze, staring down at the terrified man on the floor. From the carpet, Pete hissed at his friend. He aggressively urged the younger boy to finish the job, demanding he pull the trigger before the homeowner realized he was dealing with panicked teenagers and decided to fight back. Billy squeezed his eyes shut. He pulled the trigger. A deafening, catastrophic crack ruptured the silence of the condominium. The hollow point bullet struck Greg in the side of the head. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. His body collapsed forward, hitting the hallway floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. The metallic ringing of the gunshot bounced off the drywall, quickly replaced by a profound, suffocating stillness. The sharp, acrid stench of burnt gunpowder filled the narrow corridor. Thick, dark blood began to pool rapidly, soaking deep into the carpet, safely away from the white leather upholstery, exactly as the director had demanded. Panic immediately hijacked the teenagers' motor skills. The adrenaline surge pushed them into a frantic frenzy to execute the second phase of the operation. They scrambled over the body and sprinted into the master bedroom, tearing drawers from the dressers and violently scattering clothing across the floor. They snatched a handful of inexpensive jewelry, stuffing the items into their pockets to fabricate the illusion of a random burglary gone wrong. In their blind haste, they left expensive, easily pawned electronic equipment entirely untouched. A glaring amateur mistake that would later severely complicate the narrative. Within minutes, the boys bolted back down the stairs, fleeing through the basement doors and vanishing into the cool night air to find their idling getaway car. Less than an hour later, the architect of the slaughter returned to the scene. She did not return alone. She had deliberately offered a ride home to a teenage student intern, ensuring she had a naive, unimpeachable witness present for her upcoming performance. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open. She feigned immediate confusion at the darkness and the violently ransacked living room. She called out her husband's name. She took a few steps down the hallway. Upon looking down at the lifeless, blood-soaked remains of the man she had married just 1 year prior, she unleashed a theatrical masterpiece of hysteria. She let out a piercing scream, turning and sprinting back out the front door into the quiet street. She desperately pounded on her neighbors' doors, sobbing uncontrollably and demanding someone call an ambulance. When the local patrol cruisers arrived, their red and blue lights slicing through the suburban darkness, they found a young widow shattered by grief. She was hyperventilating, physically supported by her shocked neighbors. She appeared completely broken. But as the seasoned detectives secured the crime scene and began taking her initial statement, they noted something subtly discordant about the grieving woman. Her cries were incredibly loud, yet her face lacked the physical swelling of genuine anguish. Her eyes remained remarkably dry, despite the supposedly blinding shock of finding her husband executed in their hallway. She answered the investigators' questions with precise, chronological, and highly articulate detail. Her narrative flowed perfectly. It was a flawless first take, but to the trained detectives observing her in the flashing emergency lights, it felt entirely like a rehearsed performance. The investigation into Greg Smart's death initially struggled to gain momentum, hampered by the meticulous, albeit amateurish, efforts of the perpetrators. The crime scene, a staged burglary, was a paradox of high-stakes violence and baffling incompetence. Detectives moved through the condo searching for evidence that simply did not exist. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle, and no fingerprint evidence that pointed to a professional criminal. The only physical clue was a single spent .38 caliber casing and a smear of blood that the killer had managed to leave on the carpet. It was a sterile, frustrating puzzle that left the local authorities grasping for any thread to pull. The rumors swirling through the halls of Winnacunnet High School were immediate and suffocating. The students, many of whom were intimate with the media coordinator's secret after-hours gatherings, recognized the patterns of the crime long before the investigators did. They whispered about the missing school equipment, the strange disappearance of the media lab keys, and the abrupt, erratic behavior of the boys who had been favored by their director. The social environment of the school underwent a jagged, painful transformation. A palpable sense of dread settled over the campus, as if the students were collectively realizing that their mentor, the woman who taught them to frame the world through a camera lens, had been teaching them something far more sinister. The investigative breakthrough finally arrived from the most unlikely source, a 15-year-old intern named Cecilia Pierce. She had been deeply entrenched in the director's inner circle, frequently spending time at the Derry condo and observing the disturbing dynamics between the media teacher and her hand-picked group of boys. Cecilia had been deeply unsettled by the atmosphere. She witnessed the overt manipulation, the subtle grooming, and the strange dark conversations that occurred when the cameras were powered down. When the police began to tighten the perimeter around the high school social group, Cecilia made a decision that would ultimately shatter the mastermind's defense. She went to the authorities and agreed to wear a body wire. The subsequent FBI wiretaps captured a reality that was far more grotesque than the police had initially imagined. The recordings presented a chilling, dispassionate account of the mastermind's psychological control. In the transcripts, she didn't sound like a victim of circumstance or an accidental bystander. She sounded like a director in post-production. She relentlessly interrogated the teenager about the specifics of the murder, checking the quality of his performance, ensuring that every detail of the staged burglary aligned with the script she had written months prior. She expressed genuine irritation, not toward the boys who had taken a man's life, but toward their failure to hide the stolen evidence properly. She was annoyed that they had left a pair of boots in a location that might lead back to the school. She demanded to know why they had panicked and left so quickly, potentially jeopardizing the entire narrative she was constructing. The wiretaps provided the police with more than just a confession. They provided a psychological blueprint of a woman who felt absolutely zero empathy for the man she had ordered to be executed. In the tapes, she discussed her husband as if he were an obstacle that had been successfully removed, a problem solved. She spoke with a level of cold, clinical detachment that terrified the seasoned detectives. Every time she urged the boy to stick to their fabricated story, she was essentially editing the footage of the murder, to ensure a clean, compelling, and utterly false version of events reached the public. As the detectives synthesized the recordings, with the testimony starting to trickle in from the other boys, who were beginning to crack under the mounting psychological pressure, the defense of the terrified victim completely evaporated. The investigators stopped looking for a mysterious burglar and started looking for a director. They tracked the weapon, confirmed the origin of the stolen jewelry, and mapped out the exact movements of every person involved on that humid night in May. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just fitting together. They were forming a picture of premeditated, director-led execution that was as meticulously crafted as any school news segment. The mastermind was no longer the one pulling the strings. She was being slowly, inevitably tightened into them. When March of 1991 arrived, the Rockingham County Superior Court ceased to be a quiet venue for local justice. It morphed overnight into an unprecedented high-voltage media spectacle. Long before the era of ubiquitous, round-the-clock courtroom broadcasts, this proceeding was permitted to be filmed from gavel to gavel. Heavy broadcast trucks choked the narrow streets surrounding the brick building. Thick, black coaxial cables snaked through the public corridors, secured with heavy tape to the linoleum floors, leading directly to a battery of television cameras positioned strategically inside the gallery. It was the birth of a new cultural obsession, a localized tragedy amplified into daytime television programming. The public appetite for the story was voracious, fueled by the sordid intersection of a high school educator, teenage assassins, and suburban bloodshed. The atmosphere outside the courthouse resembled a carnival, complete with aggressive reporters shouting questions and locals lining up in the freezing New England air just to catch a glimpse of the defendant. The prosecution recognized early on that securing a conviction against a woman who had never actually touched the murder weapon required the absolute cooperation of the teenagers who pulled the trigger. Deals were struck in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of police interrogation rooms. The teenage foot soldiers agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges of second-degree murder. They accepted heavy, adult prison sentences with the distant hope of parole, entirely in exchange for their unfiltered testimony against their former mentor. It was a brutal transaction. The boys were forced to publicly dismantle the toxic fantasy they had been sold in the high school media lab, trading their fierce loyalty to their goddess for a fraction of leniency from the state. When the cooperating teenagers were called to the witness stand, the oppressive atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Stripped of their youthful bravado, clad in oversized, poorly fitting dress suits, they looked remarkably small beneath the harsh glare of the studio lights. The star witness, the 15-year-old trigger man, presented a deeply pathetic figure. Under oath, he meticulously detailed the mechanics of his grooming. He explained to the jury how the older woman had systematically isolated him, intoxicated him with sexual attention, and ultimately presented the assassination as a binding test of his devotion. His testimony was jagged and emotionally raw. He wept openly, his voice fracturing as he recounted the suffocating darkness of the condominium hallway and the metallic, deafening crack of the heavy revolver. Across the room, seated at the defense table, the accused mastermind remained entirely statuesque. She did not avert her gaze or offer a single display of remorse while listening to the boy she had corrupted sob through his confession. Her posture was rigidly perfect. Her outfits were carefully coordinated, her hair teased and styled with the precise volume required for standard-definition television broadcasts. To the seasoned journalists packed into the gallery, it was intensely unsettling to observe a defendant who appeared far more concerned with her lighting and camera angles than the prospect of spending the rest of her natural life in a maximum security penitentiary. The state's devastating centerpiece was not just the tears of a manipulated adolescent, but the cold, indisputable permanence of magnetic tape. Prosecutors played the audio recordings secured by the teenage intern. As the cassettes rolled, the defendant's disembodied voice filled the hushed courtroom. The jury listened in stunned silence as she casually critiqued the execution, complained about the logistical failures of the getaway, and coached the intern on how to evade police questioning. The acoustic quality was rough, plagued by analog static, but the psychological implications were crystal clear. The recording stripped away any remaining illusion of her innocence. They exposed a calculating, utterly remorseless architect attempting to manage a severe crisis of production. In a desperate, high-stakes gamble, the defense team put their client on the stand. It was the exact moment the television networks had been anticipating. She approached the witness box with the practiced, effortless confidence of a local anchorwoman stepping up to a teleprompter. Her testimony was a masterclass in deflection. She vehemently denied ever orchestrating the hit. She crafted an entirely alternative narrative, claiming that the teenage boy had developed a dangerous, unreciprocated obsession with her. She insisted that he had acted entirely on his own, executing her husband in a blind, sociopathic fit of adolescent jealousy. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, terrorized by an abusive husband, stalked by an unstable student, and unfairly persecuted by an aggressive media establishment eager for ratings. But her polished veneer rapidly disintegrated under the crushing pressure of cross-examination. The lead prosecutor methodically boxed her into tight corners, using her own recorded words to trap her in a labyrinth of contradictions. When directly confronted with the audio tapes, her explanations became increasingly strained and intellectually insulting. She attempted to redefine clear, conspiratorial instructions as innocent, out-of-context misunderstandings. The more she spoke to defend her carefully constructed image, the more her sociopathic detachment bled through the heavy foundation and applied makeup. She could perform flawlessly when she controlled the script, but under the harsh, unscripted interrogation of a seasoned trial attorney, her absolute lack of fundamental human empathy became the most damning evidence of all. The jury was no longer looking at a grieving widow or a frightened educator. They were looking at a director whose final production had spectacularly collapsed. The jury's deliberation was remarkably brief, a direct reflection of the crushing weight of the audio wiretaps. After less than 14 hours locked in an isolated room, the foreperson delivered the final act. The 23-year-old former media coordinator was found guilty of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. The presiding judge bypassed any drawn-out monologue, immediately handing down the state's mandatory sentence. It was absolute life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. There was no theatrical breakdown at the defense table. She absorbed the total eradication of her freedom with the exact same chilling, blank composure she had maintained throughout the spectacle. The teenage foot soldiers faced a drastically different reality. The triggerman and the boy who wielded the hunting knife both received sentences of 28 years to life, a heavy, concrete toll for a violently misguided infatuation. The getaway driver and the lookout absorbed lesser, though still substantial, terms in state custody. They traded the entirety of their youth to escape a lifetime behind bars, slowly aging into forgotten men. Meanwhile, the mastermind who had engineered their destruction was permanently exiled to a 6 by 9 foot cell, finally receiving the captive audience she always wanted, just not the one she had planned for. Decades later, the architect of the New Hampshire condominium murder remains locked behind reinforced steel. She spent her early 20s meticulously crafting a flawless suburban persona, desperately chasing the glaring spotlight of national television. In the end, she got exactly what she wanted. Her name became universally recognized, broadcast across millions of screens worldwide. But the heavy iron doors of a maximum security penitentiary serve as a constant, suffocating reminder. She is no longer the director of the narrative. She is simply an aging inmate, trapped forever in the final frame of her own grisly production. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A New York City police officer opens her front door to a homicide detective. The news is brutal. Her estranged husband has been murdered. She gasps, burying her face in her hands, playing the part of the grieving widow to perfection. But behind the tears, there is a cold, calculated thrill. The officer isn't shocked by the execution. She ordered it. The badge she wore to protect the innocent was just a shield, hiding a predator who tried to buy a double assassination. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Valerie Cincinnelli was not a product of the criminal underworld. She was an enforcer of the law, a woman who spent 12 years navigating the complex, often brutal streets of Queens as an officer for the New York Police Department. She understood the mechanics of a homicide investigation better than most because she had stood on the other side of the yellow tape. Outwardly, her career trajectory projected dedication and competence. In the summer of 2017, she even tasted the brief, intoxicating rush of public heroism. When a bank robbery unfolded in her precinct, Cincinnati reacted with the sharp, decisive instincts drilled into her at the academy. She played a pivotal role in foiling the heist, earning a commendation and the respect of her commanding officers. Standing in a crisp Navy uniform, she looked the part of the perfect cop. But that polished, professional exterior was nothing more than a fragile veneer, masking a volatile and dangerous psychological landscape. Her experience on the force eventually landed her a specialized, behind-the-scenes assignment in the NYPD's Viper Unit. This was the department's video surveillance nerve center. Inside a dimly lit room humming with the low vibration of heavy servers, Cincinnati spent her shifts staring into a wall of glowing monitors. She watched the city from a godlike vantage point, tracking the movements of suspects across thousands of interconnected cameras. She learned the exact moments criminals slipped up. She studied their digital footprints, the blind spots in the surveillance grid, and the meticulous ways detectives pieced together timelines from scattered footage. It was an education in catching killers. Ultimately, she would attempt to use this very knowledge as a masterclass in how to get away with murder. Despite the commendations and her specialized skills, the NYPD brass recognized that something was fundamentally broken within Cincinnati. The rigid discipline required to wear the badge vanished the moment she clocked out. Her home in Oceanside, a quiet Long Island suburb with neatly manicured lawns and spacious driveways, was far from a domestic sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker of escalating aggression. Cincinnati possessed a hair-trigger temper, an explosive, irrational rage that could ignite over the slightest provocation. Her personal life was a chaotic web of intense arguments, screaming matches, and threats. She demanded absolute control over her partners, and when she felt that control slipping, her reactions were terrifying. The breaking point occurred long before any hitman was hired. In 2017, the exact same year she was lauded for stopping the Queens bank robber, her private life imploded violently enough to breach the walls of her precinct. Following a string of highly volatile domestic disputes involving both her estranged husband, Isaiah Carvalho Jr., and her subsequent boyfriends, the police department intervened. The Internal Affairs Bureau investigated the endless cycle of domestic disturbances and reached a chilling conclusion. The institution that had trained her, the department that had pinned a badge to her chest, officially deemed her too emotionally unstable to carry a firearm. In a humiliating bureaucratic move, superiors stripped Cincinnati of her 9mm service Glock. She was placed on modified assignment, effectively benched from active patrol. Her days of riding in a cruiser were replaced with menial desk work, pushing paper while enduring the silent, knowing glances of her colleagues. For a woman whose entire identity was built on the power and authority of being a cop, this demotion was a devastating blow to her ego. It was a glaring, desperate red flag, a siren warning that the officer was spiraling out of control. But confiscating her weapon did not neutralize the threat. Stripped of her physical gun, Cincinnati simply changed tactics. She began to weaponize her mind, her manipulative charm, and her deep insider knowledge of the justice system. The NYPD had taken away her ability to pull a trigger, so she decided to find someone else to pull it for her. To understand the depths of this obsession with control, one has to look at the wreckage of her marriage to Isaiah Carvalho Jr. They had shared a life, a home, and a young son, but the union was defined by its fractures. Carvalho bore the brunt of her hair-trigger temper. By early 2018, the relationship had completely disintegrated. Carvalho filed for divorce, seeking a desperate way out of the constant emotional crossfire. But in Cincinnati's mind, a partner did not just get to walk away. The separation ignited a bitter, protracted legal battle, primarily centered around custody and assets. The quiet, tree-lined streets of their Long Island neighborhood frequently echoed with the muffled sounds of slamming doors and vicious arguments. The domestic environment was toxic, heavy with the suffocating tension of two people who had grown to despise one another. There was one specific asset that drove the suspended officer into a state of blind, unyielding fury: her NYPD pension. In the state of New York, a spouse is legally entitled to a portion of that retirement fund. To a career cop, the pension is sacred. It represents decades of navigating dangerous streets, the stress, the mandatory overtime, the freezing winter night shifts, and the heavy toll the job takes on the body and mind. The idea that Carvalho would receive a cut of her hard-earned money felt like a profound, unforgivable betrayal. She obsessively calculated the financial loss, viewing it not as a legal standard, but as a personal theft. Her resentment metastasized. It became a daily fixation. She spent hours pacing her living room, verbally tearing into her ex-husband to anyone who would listen. The money was hers, she had earned it, and she would do anything to protect it. In the midst of this toxic divorce, a new figure entered her crosshairs. John DeRubba was an older man with a rough-around-the-edges demeanor that belied a surprisingly accommodating personality. He was instantly captivated by the off-duty cop. She was commanding, fiercely protective of her space, and carried an undeniable magnetic intensity. At first, their dynamic felt like a passionate whirlwind. DeRubba provided a distraction from the crushing reality of family court. He was attentive, generous, and completely devoted to her. He would drive miles out of his way just to bring her dinner or run errands, eager to please a woman who demanded absolute loyalty. But the honeymoon phase evaporated almost overnight. The same controlling behaviors that suffocated Carvalho soon wrapped around DeRubba like a vice. Cincinnelli demanded constant updates on his whereabouts. If he did not answer his phone immediately, she spiraled into wild accusations and rage. Her anxiety manifested as a desperate need to dictate every hour of his day. DeRubba found himself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to placate a woman whose emotional baseline was pure hostility. He absorbed the screaming matches, the hurled insults, and the erratic mood swings, rationalizing it all as the temporary stress of her impending divorce. He thought he could fix her, or at least calm the storm. He was dead wrong. Yet, the true catalyst for the impending horror was not her ex-husband. It was DeRubba's 14-year-old daughter. The teenager lived a completely normal life, residing in a neighboring town just a few miles away. She was entirely removed from the chaotic orbit of her father's new girlfriend. She went to school, hung out with friends, and expected the standard emotional and financial support any child needs from a parent. But in Cincinnelli's distorted psychological landscape, this child was not a daughter, she was a rival. The suspended officer's jealousy defied all logic. It was a pathological, all-consuming hatred. Whenever DeRubba spent time with the teenager, Cincinnelli's anger boiled over. She resented every dollar he spent on the girl, every weekend they shared, and every ounce of affection that diverted his attention away from her. She viewed his basic parental obligations as a direct, personal insult. The teenager was unknowingly draining resources, both emotional and financial, that Cincinnelli firmly believed belonged exclusively to her. This was not typical step-parent friction. It was a terrifying manifestation of absolute narcissism. She demanded total emotional subjugation from her partner. When DeRubba bought his daughter gifts, paid for her clothes, or simply wanted to spend a Saturday afternoon with her, Cincinnelli perceived it as a direct threat to her own security and dominance. She complained bitterly about the girl, her private rants becoming increasingly vicious and unhinged. She tracked the money DeRubba spent, obsessing over the math, just as she had with her police pension. The financial paranoia was a sickness, clouding her judgment and poisoning her every interaction. The resentment formed a deadly, inescapable nexus in her mind. On one side, her estranged husband was legally poised to take a massive cut of her hard-earned money. On the other, a teenager was taking her new boyfriend's time and resources, money that Cincinnelli felt she was entitled to control. She felt cornered, victimized by the very people she was supposed to care for. For a woman trained to assess, confront, and neutralize threats on the streets of New York, the solution began to look horrifyingly simple. The anger was no longer just verbal venting. It was crystallizing into a concrete plan, a cold, calculated strategy to permanently erase the obstacles in her path. The surveillance expert was about to go on the offensive. The winter of 2019 hung heavy over Long Island, a bitter, biting cold that seemed to perfectly mirror the atmosphere inside the Oceanside residence. By February, the suspended officer's resentment had calcified into a permanent state of hostility. The daily routine devolved into an endless, obsessive loop of financial calculations regarding her NYPD pension and vicious rants about the teenager who was allegedly draining her boyfriend's bank account. But beneath the surface of this domestic misery, a far more sinister cognitive shift was taking place. The grievances were no longer just complaints. They were becoming a target list. The transition from a bitter ex-wife to a domestic terrorist did not happen with a sudden snap. It was a slow, terrifying normalization of violence. She began dropping hypothetical scenarios into casual evening conversations. She would study John Dhoruba, carefully gauging his reactions, analyzing his demeanor with the same clinical detachment she once used to interrogate suspects in a Queens precinct. Dhoruba carried a tough, streetwise exterior, a persona that convinced her he possessed deep connections to the local criminal underworld. She assumed he knew people who operated outside the law, people who could solve her problems for a price. Eventually, the hypotheticals vanished, replaced by a formal, chilling directive. She instructed Dhoruba to reach out to his contacts and hire a professional hitman. She presented the plan with the same logistical pragmatism one might use to organize a home renovation. The targets were explicitly named. First, her estranged husband, Isaiah Carvalho Jr. Second, Dhoruba's own 14-year-old daughter. The sheer, unfathomable audacity of demanding a father coordinate the assassination of his own child highlighted the depth of her narcissistic detachment. In her twisted pathology, the teenager was simply an obstacle to her financial dominance, a nuisance that needed to be permanently erased. The budget for this double assassination was meticulously calculated, $7,000. That was the exact valuation she placed on 2 human lives. To prove her terrifying sincerity, she drove to a local bank branch and withdrew the funds in cold, hard cash. Handing over the thick envelope of bills, she explained her reasoning. A cash transaction severed the digital paper trail, ensuring no financial crimes investigator could ever link the payout back to her accounts. Initially, Dhoruba tried to rationalize the horrific demands. He convinced himself it was merely the dark, twisted humor of a stressed cop, a desperate woman venting her frustrations through extreme hyperbole. But as February dragged on, the demands grew increasingly specific, stripping away any illusion of a sick joke. She was not just asking for a murder, she was architecting it. Leaning heavily on her 12 years of law enforcement experience, she began lecturing him on the mechanics of a successful homicide. She detailed the necessity of establishing an airtight electronic alibi, explaining exactly how cell tower pings worked and why bringing personal devices anywhere near the crime scenes would be a fatal rookie mistake. Drawing from her specialized tenure in the Viper unit, she mapped out the vast network of city surveillance. She warned him about specific intersections equipped with automated license plate readers and detailed the blind spots where a hired killer could slip away undetected. She mapped out the timeline for Carvalho's execution first. She suggested the hitman ambush him near his workplace in Holtzville, a location she deemed isolated enough to avoid immediate witnesses. As for the teenager, the suspended officer displayed a profound lack of humanity, aggressively demanding a timeline for when the girl would be eliminated. When Dhoruba attempted to stall, citing logistical issues with the fictitious hitman, she pushed back with tactical adjustments, suggesting they wait a few weeks between the murders, so the local homicide squads would not draw a connection between the 2 seemingly isolated events. A sickening, paralyzing realization settled in Dhoruba's gut. The woman sleeping next to him was not just angry, was a highly trained, deeply methodical predator actively hunting his family. The physical toll of this realization was immense. He found himself trapped in an unimaginable psychological hostage situation. If he simply packed his bags and left, he knew she would not stop. She had the training, the badge, and the access to restricted law enforcement databases to track him and his daughter anywhere in the country. She could easily find another triggerman. Or worse, her stripped service weapon did not preclude her from acquiring an illegal firearm and doing the job herself. Going to the local authorities presented an equally terrifying risk. She was a 12-year veteran of the NYPD. She had friends in local precincts, union delegates who would protect her, and a network of blue wall loyalty that might view his accusations as the malicious lies of a bitter boyfriend. If a local detective tipped her off about his police report, the consequences would be swift and fatal. Dahruba was cornered, sharing a home with a ticking bomb, playing along with the murder-for-hire plot just to buy time. He absorbed her tactical lectures, nodded at her horrific demands, and pretended to coordinate with a phantom assassin, all while his mind raced for a viable exit strategy. By the end of the month, the burden of the deadly secret forced his hand. He realized there was only one agency equipped to dismantle a rogue cop without alerting her local network. Bypassing the local police entirely, Dahruba made a quiet, desperate drive to a federal building. He walked through the heavy glass doors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sat down with a team of special agents, and laid out the entire sprawling conspiracy. In that sterile interview room, the dynamic fundamentally changed. Dahruba transitioned from a terrified boyfriend into a highly sensitive federal asset. The FBI recognized the immediate, lethal threat posed by a police officer utilizing insider tactics to orchestrate a double homicide. But an informant's word against a decorated cop was not enough to secure a conviction. They needed undeniable, irrefutable proof. They needed her to orchestrate her own downfall on tape. The federal sting operation was officially authorized, and the trap was set. Transitioning a civilian into a federal asset against a trained police veteran is an operation fraught with catastrophic risk. The FBI understood the extreme volatility of their target. They were not surveilling an amateur. They were hunting an insider, someone intimately familiar with undercover tactics, wiretaps, and the behavioral tells of an informant. To build a bulletproof case, federal handlers outfitted the boyfriend with covert recording equipment. Microscopic lenses and highly sensitive transmitters were woven into his daily attire. The psychological burden placed on the civilian was crushing. He had to return to the Oceanside home, sit on the same couch as the woman actively trying to purchase the slaughter of his own child, and play the role of a willing accomplice. One misplaced hand during a hug, one suspicious bulge beneath his shirt, or one poorly timed nervous glance could trigger her violent instincts. The domestic space transformed into a federal listening post. Throughout the spring of 2019, audio files began flooding into FBI databases, capturing a terrifying portrait of a fractured, predatory psyche. The tapes revealed a complete absence of moral hesitation. There were no hushed, panicked whispers in the dark. Instead, the suspended officer discussed the impending double assassination with the casual, detached cadence of someone reviewing a grocery list. Federal agents listened in real time as the banality of domestic chatter seamlessly pivoted into the logistics of murder. Her expertise in law enforcement took center stage, captured perfectly on the wire. She was not relying on the phantom hitman to figure out the details. She was architecting the execution herself. The recordings caught her methodically dissecting the geography of the primary target's routine. She pinpointed her estranged husband's workplace in Holtzville, noting the specific traffic patterns and isolation of the area. She instructed the informant on exactly where the assassin should wait, evaluating the sightlines and the optimal escape routes to avoid local patrol sectors. But the most chilling audio centered on her obsession with digital forensics. Drawing heavily from her years in the NYPD's video surveillance unit, she delivered a masterclass in counterintelligence. She understood exactly how homicide detectives build timelines. The tapes captured her explicitly, detailing the absolute necessity of creating an impenetrable electronic alibi. She lectured her partner on the mechanics of cellular triangulation, how investigators subpoena historical cell site data to place suspects within a specific radius of a crime scene. Her mandate was absolute. When the kill order was finally executed, their digital footprint had to be non-existent. She instructed him that every single GPS-enabled device, smartphones, tablets, and even smartwatches, had to remain powered on and completely stationary inside her Long Island residence. Furthermore, their vehicles could not pass through any toll plazas equipped with automated license plate readers. The plan required them to physically travel to a populated public location miles away from the kill zones. They would ensure their faces were captured on multiple commercial security feeds, establishing a rock-solid, verifiable alibi while the blood was being spilled elsewhere. It was textbook reasonable doubt, engineered by a woman who had spent over a decade watching criminals make fatal operational errors. As the weeks dragged on, the operation required the informant to continuously stall. He fed her carefully crafted excuses provided by his federal handlers. The hitman was conducting surveillance. The timing was slightly off. The perimeter was too hot. The delays enraged her. The hidden microphones picked up her escalating impatience, her voice hardening with genuine frustration. She demanded results. The hostility peaked when the conversation shifted back to the secondary target. The audio captured her chilling lack of humanity as she aggressively pushed for the teenager's elimination. She suggested the assassin strike over the weekend, actively tracking the girl to a specific local hangout spot to ensure the job was done. There was no wavering, only a cold, transactional demand for finality. She wanted the financial drains on her life permanently severed. Federal prosecutors reviewing the transcripts recognized they possessed a mountain of damning evidence. They had the recorded intent, the detailed logistical planning, and the overt act of the initial cash withdrawal. But in a courtroom, a skilled defense attorney could still attempt to spin the narrative. They could argue the recordings merely captured the dark, exaggerated venting of a deeply stressed woman going through a bitter divorce, a toxic fantasy rather than a literal conspiracy. To completely neutralize any potential defense of entrapment or hyperbole, the FBI needed to push the operation past the point of theoretical planning. They needed absolute, undeniable proof of her homicidal commitment. The Bureau determined that listening was no longer enough. The surveillance phase had achieved its maximum utility. To secure an ironclad indictment against a sworn officer of the law, the federal agents prepared to cross the threshold. They needed to present her with the ultimate proof of death, look her in the eye, and record exactly how she tried to bury the truth. The sting was about to go live. May 17, 2019. The day the FBI decided the conspiracy had reached its lethal maturity. For weeks, the agents had been playing a dangerous game of shadow and light, feeding the suspended officers' hunger for vengeance while shielding the targets from genuine harm. But the masquerade had to end. They needed the final, undeniable anchor for the prosecution. The moment when the theoretical plan crossed the threshold into an active, violent reality. The Bureau staged the scene with terrifying precision. They intercepted Isaiah Carvalho Jr. in his vehicle, carefully informing him that he was the target of a high-stakes hit. With his cooperation, the agents orchestrated a grim, theatrical tableau. They took photographs of the interior of his car, artfully arranging the scene to appear as though a struggle had ended in his assassination. It was a macabre set piece, designed to satisfy the specific, bloodthirsty requirements the officer had laid out in her instructions. The FBI then turned to the second target, shielding the 14-year-old girl in a location completely unknown to the conspirators. The physical threat to both victims was neutralized. Now, the federal agents waited for the only piece of evidence that would guarantee a conviction: the confirmation of the hit. In the late morning, the informant reached out to Cicinelli, his voice strained by the weight of the federal machinery humming in the background. He delivered the news she had been clamoring for. He told her the job was done. He described the scene at the stage location, confirming that the targets had been eliminated as she had requested. He even provided the false visual proof, sending the images of the staged crime scene. For a heartbeat, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, Cicinelli's reaction was not one of horror or remorse. It was immediate, cold, and entirely focused on the cleanup. She did not ask about the victims. She did not express a flicker of hesitation. She shifted instantly into the mode of a police veteran who knew exactly how the NYPD would respond to a double homicide. She directed the informant to destroy every shred of evidence that could link them to the event. She explicitly ordered him to purge his phone of every single text message, to delete the call logs, and to wipe the device clean before the inevitable knock on the door came. She was not just a client, she was managing the crime scene from a distance, utilizing her tactical knowledge to ensure the trail went cold before the local precinct even arrived. She hung up the phone and began the wait. But she wasn't waiting for the police. She was waiting to resume her life, untethered from the financial burdens that had pushed her to the brink. A few hours later, the illusion of safety shattered. Two detectives from the local precinct, cops Cincinnati knew and had worked alongside for years, pulled up to her Oceanside residence. They were not there to arrest her. They were there to fulfill their duty as the primary responders to the crime scene. The lead detective approached the door with a grim expression, tasked with the most difficult notification of his career. He knocked firmly. When Cincinnati opened the door, he delivered the script. Isaiah Carvalho Jr. had been found dead in his car. Cincinnati reacted with the rehearsed grace of a seasoned performer. She went through the motions, the shock, the staggered step back, the gasping breaths, the tears that flowed right on cue. It was a masterclass in deception. She played the grieving, blindsided ex-wife to perfection, leaning into the detective as if the weight of the news was physically crushing her. Inside the house, the facade remained rigid. She excused herself, hurried to a private room, and pulled out her phone. She felt an urgent, frantic need to ensure her accomplice had followed her cleanup instructions. She dialed the informant's number, her voice trembling, not with grief, but with the high-stakes anxiety of a criminal ensuring the evidence was erased. She demanded to know if he had scrubbed the messages. She reinforced the command. Delete everything, get rid of the logs, don't leave a single byte of data behind. She was still in the mindset of a Viper unit officer, confident that if the digital paper trail was gone, the case would disintegrate into an unsolvable mystery. She was wrong. The FBI had not just been recording the calls, they had been monitoring the entire architecture of her deceit. Every word she spoke, every tactical instruction she issued, and every panicked directive to hide the evidence was streaming directly into a federal server. As she hung up, finally feeling that the loose ends were tied, the reality of her environment changed. The air in the Oceanside house seemed to grow heavy. Through the windows, she might have seen the flash of dark SUVs rolling silently onto the street. The detectives she had just performed for were likely already moving toward their secondary objective. The FBI did not wait for the local police to finish their formal notification. They did not care about protocol. They moved in with overwhelming force. Agents swarmed the residence, their tactical gear flashing in the midday light. The front door was breached, and Cincinnati, who had spent the morning orchestrating a murder from the comfort of her living room, found herself surrounded by the very agency that had been listening to her for months. The handcuffs clicked shut with finality. The badge-wearing protector of the law was suddenly the subject of a federal indictment. As they led her out, she was no longer a cop. She was a defendant in a federal murder-for-hire investigation. The cold calculation that had carried her through the winter of 2019 had finally, and spectacularly, collided with the reality of federal justice. Her career, her pension, her reputation, and her freedom evaporated in that singular moment of surrender. The observer in the Viper unit had finally been observed, and she was completely, utterly caught. The judicial process moved with the same swift, crushing momentum as the FBI raid. Cincinnati's arraignment occurred shortly after her arrest, severing her completely from the life she had known. There was no leniency for a disgraced officer. The judge ordered her held without bail, locking her in a federal holding cell while the media devoured the spectacle of a corrupt cop. The prosecution possessed hours of damning audio, but trials involving undercover sting operations are inherently unpredictable. Instead of risking a drawn-out courtroom battle over entrapment defenses, federal prosecutors offered a calculated plea deal. The explosive murder-for-hire charges were ultimately dropped. In their place, Cincinnati pleaded guilty to a single count of obstruction of justice, a formal acknowledgement of her desperate, frantic attempts to destroy the electronic evidence of her assassination plot. She stood before a federal judge, permanently stripped of her authority, and listened to the final verdict. The sentence was 48 months in federal prison, 4 years behind bars for a woman who had spent over a decade putting others there. We inherently trust those sworn to protect us. We believe a badge represents a shield against the monsters lurking in the dark. But Valerie Cincinnati proved that sometimes the predator wears the uniform. She attempted to weaponize her deep law enforcement expertise to slaughter her own family, hunting them from behind a veil of absolute authority. In the end, the very system she tried to outsmart became the trap that broke her. A brutal reminder that the most lethal threats are often the ones entrusted with our safety. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.